There is a place where the sky and the sea become the same color, where the horizon disappears into gray, and where silence can mean either safety or death. It is not a place on any map that civilians carry. It has no name on a tourist chart, no landmark, no shore. It is simply the open Atlantic, cold, enormous, and in 1942, the most dangerous stretch of water on the face of the earth. Men crossed it every week, thousands of them. They were not soldiers in any traditional sense. They wore no polished boots, carried no rifles, and received no medals at grand ceremonies. They were merchant sailors, ordinary men, from Liverpool and Halifax, from New Orleans and Oslo, from Cardiff and Cape Breton, and they loaded their ships with food, fuel, steel, and ammunition, and they sailed. They sailed knowing that somewhere beneath the surface, something was hunting them, and most of the time, they could not see it, could not hear it, and could not stop it. This is the story of that ocean in that year, and it is unlike any other story from the Second World War. Most people know 1942 through its land battles. They know the desert of North Africa, the frozen approaches to Stalingrad, the jungles of the Pacific. But while those campaigns raged on solid ground, a quieter and arguably more decisive battle was being fought in the open water of the Atlantic. A battle with no front line, no flags planted in captured territory, no visible advance or retreat, just ships going down, and the men trying to keep them afloat, and the men trying to sink them. What made 1942 different? What made it the darkest year of the Atlantic War was not simply the scale of the losses, though the losses were staggering. It was the combination of factors that converged all at once. America had just entered the conflict, bringing enormous potential, but also enormous inexperience, and a coastal defense that was, in the early months, almost laughably inadequate. German U-boats were reaching the peak of their operational effectiveness, commanded by an admiral who had spent years thinking of almost nothing else but how to strangle Britain by sea. The intelligence systems that Allied planners had relied upon to route convoys away from danger had gone dark, plunging the routing officers into a kind of navigational blindness. And the technology, the weapons, the aircraft, and the training needed to fight back effectively were all still months or years away from being ready. Britain needed American supply to survive, not as a convenience, not as a strategic preference, as a biological necessity. The food on British tables, the fuel in British engines, the steel in British factories, almost all of it had to cross the Atlantic. Winston Churchill, who had faced the prospect of invasion, the Blitz, the fall of France, and the loss of empire with outward steadiness, would later write that the only thing that truly frightened him during the war was the U-boat peril. That is a remarkable confession from a man who was not given to admitting fear. And Germany knew it. Admiral Karl Dönitz, the architect of the U-boat campaign, understood with cold mathematical clarity that if his submarines could sink Allied shipping faster than it could be built and replaced, Britain would starve, America's armies could never reach Europe, and the war in the West would be won without a single German soldier setting foot on English soil. The ocean itself was the weapon. Dönitz simply needed enough submarines to use it. In 1942, he came terrifyingly close to having exactly that. What you are about to hear is the full story of that year, not just the battles, but the decisions, the failures, the ingenuity, the grief, and the slow, painful turning of a tide that had run almost entirely in Germany's favor. You will hear about the wolf packs and the convoy routes, about the code breakers who lost the thread and fought to find it again, about the shipyards that began building vessels faster than submarines could sink them, about the tanker crews who sailed through waters that were sometimes literally on fire, You will hear about men rescued from lifeboats after days in freezing seas, and about the commanders who sometimes had to make the unbearable choice to leave survivors behind rather than stop and risk losing another ship. This is not a story with a clean, satisfying arc. 1942 does not end in Allied victory. It ends in exhaustion, in incomplete progress, in hard-won lessons that would not fully bear fruit until the following year. But it is precisely because of what was endured in 1942, every convoy battle, every intelligence breakthrough, every Liberty ship launched, every escort crew trained, that the eventual turning of the Atlantic War became possible at all. The men who sailed in this year, on both sides of the surface of that ocean, did not know how the story ended. They knew only the next watch, the next patrol, the next bearing, the next sound on the hydrophone. They made decisions with incomplete information, in darkness, in fear, and sometimes in desperation. Many of them did not come home. The ones who did carry a story that has never received the attention it deserves. Tonight, we give it that attention. If you are new to this channel, welcome. We make long-form documentary narrations about the wars and campaigns that shaped our world, told slowly, carefully, and with respect for the people who lived through them. If this is the kind of storytelling that helps you rest, or think, or simply feel connected to a history larger than your own, then settle in, turn down the lights. Let the sound of this wash over you. There are no commercials cutting across the quiet, no sudden noises to jolt you awake, just the story, told from beginning to end. And if you find value in what we do here, please consider subscribing. Every subscriber tells us that these stories matter, that the slow and serious telling of history has a place in this world, and that the men and women who lived through moments like the Battle of the Atlantic deserve more than a paragraph in a textbook. It costs you nothing, and it means everything to us. Now, close your eyes, if that helps, or let your gaze go soft on the ceiling above you. Breathe slowly. We begin in the early days of January 1942. The Atlantic is already a killing ground. The year ahead will be the worst in the history of ocean warfare. And somewhere out there, beyond the range of any aircraft, beyond the reach of any shore, a convoy of slow ships is moving through the dark. They do not know what is waiting for them, but we do. The Atlantic Ocean does not care about calendars. It does not mark the turning of a year, does not pause for declarations of war or treaties signed in distant capitals. It simply moves, grey and indifferent, heaving beneath winter skies. And in the first days of 1942, it was already a graveyard. The ships going down were not abstractions. They were freighters loaded with grain, tankers riding heavy with oil, cargo vessels carrying machine parts, ammunition, food, and the 10,000 other things that kept a nation fighting. The men aboard them were not soldiers in any traditional sense. They were merchant sailors, longshoremen and fishermen and farmhands who had ended up at sea. Ordinary men doing an extraordinary thing, sailing into waters that had already claimed more than they could know. To understand what 1942 meant in the Atlantic, you must first understand what the ocean represented in strategic terms. Britain, by the opening of that year, had been at war for more than 2 years. Its own industrial capacity, formidable in peacetime, was strained almost to the point of rupture by the demands of fighting a global conflict on multiple fronts simultaneously. The island nation that had once commanded the world's greatest empire now depended, with quiet and desperate urgency, on a continuous stream of ships crossing roughly 3,000 miles of open ocean from North American ports. Without that stream, there was no fuel for aircraft, no steel for tanks, no food for civilians, no ammunition for the armies holding the line in North Africa and preparing for whatever came next. The convoy lifeline was not a strategic asset among many. It was the precondition for everything else. The routes themselves had a brutal geography. Ships gathered in the ports of Halifax, New York, and other eastern seaboard anchorages, formed into convoys of dozens of vessels, and set out across waters that grew colder and more treacherous as the season deepened into winter. The North Atlantic in January is not a place of beauty. It is a place of mountainous seas and freezing spray, of visibility that can collapse to nothing inside minutes, of storms that scatter convoy formations across hundreds of miles of ocean. The men who sailed those routes did so knowing that weather alone might kill them, and that weather was only the beginning of what the ocean held in 1942. Beneath those grey swells, German submarines were already waiting. The U-boat campaign did not begin in 1942. It had been building and bleeding since the first weeks of the war. By the close of 1941, the German Navy's submarine arm had already demonstrated its capacity to inflict catastrophic losses on Allied shipping. The early months of the war had seen the so-called First Happy Time, when U-boats operating largely without coordinated opposition had sunk merchant vessels at a rate that alarmed the British Admiralty to its core. Convoy systems had been introduced, escorts assigned, and gradually the losses had become more manageable. But manageable was a relative term. Thousands of tons of Allied shipping had already been lost before the year turned. The ocean floor of the North Atlantic already held a growing library of sunken hulls and the men who had gone down with them. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commanding the German submarine fleet from his headquarters at Lorient on the French Atlantic coast, had spent the final months of 1941 in a state of focused frustration. His U-boats were skilled, his tactics refined, his crews among the most technically capable in the German military. But he had never had enough submarines. The German naval construction program had not prioritized the submarine arm as aggressively as Dönitz had argued for throughout the interwar years and into the conflict itself. As 1941 closed, he commanded a fleet that was growing, but still far smaller than he believed was necessary to do what he knew the submarine could do: cut Britain's supply lines so thoroughly that continued resistance became impossible. He had studied the mathematics with the cold precision of a man who believed in tonnage the way others believed in territory. If more ships could be sunk each month than could be built to replace them, Britain would eventually run dry. It was, in his estimation, a question of arithmetic. What changed everything, for both sides, was the entry of the United States into the war, following the events of December 1941. For the Allied cause broadly, American belligerence was the strategic transformation that made eventual victory conceivable. The industrial capacity of the United States, its population, its raw materials, its potential for military production on a scale that dwarfed anything Europe could sustain, all of this now stood formally committed to the defeat of the Axis powers. Britain's leaders, Churchill foremost among them, felt a relief so profound it bordered on euphoria. But in the Atlantic, in the cold practicality of ocean warfare, the American entry into the war created not an immediate improvement, but an immediate and devastating new vulnerability. The United States Navy, in December of 1941, was not prepared for the kind of war Dönitz was ready to bring to American waters. Its attention, its doctrine, and much of its force structure had been oriented toward the Pacific. Its anti-submarine capacity was thin, its convoy protocols for coastal waters essentially non-existent, and its institutional understanding of just how dangerous the U-boat threat truly was remained. Despite British warnings shared across months of increasingly close cooperation, dangerously incomplete. The eastern seaboard of the United States, with its thousands of miles of coastline and its rivers of shipping moving between ports, was about to become a hunting ground, of a kind that the Atlantic had not yet seen. Donitz knew this before the first American ship was sunk. He had already begun to plan. Into this inherited crisis, the men who sailed the merchant ships in early 1942 carried a burden that was only partly visible. They knew, because word spread through port communities, the way word always spreads, that ships were being lost. They knew that survivors were coming home with stories of sudden explosions in the night, of oil fires on the water, of lifeboats drifting for days before rescue came, of shipmates who did not make it into any lifeboat at all. The merchant mariner had no uniform in the traditional sense, no guaranteed status under international law as a combatant deserving of protection, and no government pension waiting if he did not return. He signed on, he sailed, and he hoped that the arithmetic of survival would fall in his favor this voyage, if not the last. It was a particular kind of courage, quiet, practical, and given almost no recognition by the societies it was sustaining. The tonnage figures from the closing months of 1941 told a story that Allied planners read with a fear they rarely expressed in public. Month after month, the losses had climbed. The replacement rate, ships coming out of British, Canadian, and American yards, had not kept pace. The net result was a shrinking Allied merchant fleet, even before the new year began. A fleet being asked to carry more cargo over longer distances with fewer ships and against a threat that was not receding, but growing. The U-boat construction program was producing new submarines faster than they were being sunk. The arithmetic that Donitz believed in was, at the opening of 1942, running in his favor. There were people in London who understood the full weight of this. The Admiralty's planners, the staff at Western Approaches Command, the analysts working the shipping figures, they understood that the margin was narrow. Churchill himself, who had lived through the First World War and knew what the U-boat had nearly done to Britain in 1917, carried this knowledge as a private, grinding anxiety. He had said, and would say again, that the only thing that truly frightened him during the war was the U-boat threat. Not the Blitz, not the fall of France, not the disasters in the Far East, the submarines. Because those other catastrophes were visible, comprehensible, answerable by force of will and arms. The ocean war was different. It was vast and dark, and it killed in silence. And the scale of what it threatened was almost impossible to communicate to a public that could not see it happening. And so 1942 begins. The ocean is already on fire, not with visible flame everywhere, but with the cumulative heat of a campaign that has been building for more than 2 years and is about to reach a new and terrible intensity. The ships are still sailing because they must. The men are still signing on because someone has to. The escorts, destroyers, corvettes, frigates, trawlers pressed into service, are still forming up around the convoys, doing what they can with what they have. And in the steel corridors of submarines running dark beneath the Atlantic swells, commanders are receiving their orders and setting their courses for waters that, within weeks, will become the most dangerous stretch of ocean in the history of naval warfare. The year has not yet shown its full face, but those who are paying attention, in the war rooms of London and Washington, in the headquarters at Lorient, in the plotting rooms of Bletchley Park, know that what is coming will test the limits of everything the Allied cause has built. The ocean does not care, it simply moves, and beneath it, the wolves are already running. When Japan struck Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941, the war that Britain had been fighting almost alone for 2.5 years suddenly acquired a new and enormously powerful partner. For the men of the Royal Navy's Western Approaches Command, and for the exhausted analysts at Bletchley Park, there was a moment of profound, almost overwhelming relief. America was in. The convoys would now have the backing of the greatest industrial economy on Earth. The shipping lanes would be reinforced. The balance, surely, would begin to shift. What those relieved men could not yet see was that the entry of the United States into the war did not immediately strengthen the Atlantic lifeline. For several terrible months, it made things dramatically worse. Admiral Karl Dönitz received the news of Pearl Harbor not with alarm, but with something closer to calculation. Germany and Italy duly declared war on the United States within days, and Dönitz moved with a speed that his superiors found almost reckless. He understood, with the precision of a man who had spent years thinking about little else, that the American eastern seaboard was essentially unguarded. The United States Navy had spent the preceding years focused on the Pacific and on neutrality. It had not built a convoy system for its own coastal waters. It had not established the shore-based patrol networks, the acoustic listening stations, the coordinated air coverage, or the trained escort groups that Britain had assembled through years of painful experience and catastrophic loss. Dönitz saw a coastline of thousands of miles, heavy with tanker traffic and merchant ships sailing individually, without zigzag patterns, without escorts, and without any apparent doctrine for dealing with submarines at their most dangerous. He called his plan Operation Paukenschlag, which translates roughly as Operation Drumbeat, and he intended it to sound exactly like that. The first U-boats departed their French Atlantic bases in late December of 1941. Dönitz had wanted to send a dozen or more, but the demands of operations elsewhere in the Atlantic and the constraints of available boats with the necessary range meant that the first wave numbered only 5. They were Type 9 submarines, the larger ocean-going variant, with the fuel capacity to cross the Atlantic and operate for weeks in American waters before returning. Dönitz was almost contemptuous of how few boats he had been allocated, believing that a larger force could have caused devastation on a scale that might have genuinely forced a strategic crisis. Even with 5 boats, what followed was staggering. The first sinkings occurred in the second week of January 1942, and within days, it was clear that the American coastal corridor had become, in the words of one German naval officer, a paradise for U-boats. The ships they found were sailing alone, on predictable routes, at predictable speeds, often with their running lights on. They were visible at night against the glow of coastal cities that had not dimmed their lights, cities where the ordinary civilian rhythm of peacetime America continued almost undisturbed. From the bridge of a surfaced U-boat, the lights of Miami or Norfolk or Cape Hatteras formed a luminous backdrop against which merchant ships presented themselves in perfect silhouette. A U-boat commander did not need to search. He needed only to wait. The ships came to him, outlined against the brightness of a nation that had not yet accepted that it was in a war that reached its own shores. Tankers, bulk carriers, freighters, they moved through the night as though the ocean were still safe, and one by one, they were found and they were sunk. The mechanics of these early attacks were almost routine in their one-sidedness. A U-boat would identify a target, maneuver into an attacking position on the surface, typically at night when the submarine was nearly impossible to spot against a dark sea, and fire from close range. The torpedoes rarely missed. Hits were frequent enough that the U-boat arm's daily situation, reports back to Lorient, read like warehouse inventories. So many thousand tons of this type, so many thousand tons of that. Survivors from the merchant ships were sometimes left clinging to wreckage within sight of the American coastline, occasionally close enough that they could see beach resort hotels still illuminated along the shore. The contrast between the lights of normalcy and the burning wreck of their ship must have carried a particular cruelty. Some men swam to shore, many did not. The United States Navy was not blind to what was happening. but it was paralyzed by a combination of institutional pride, misplaced priorities, and a genuine misunderstanding of the threat's nature. Admiral Ernest King, the Chief of Naval Operations, was a formidable figure of great personal stubbornness, who regarded the U-boat campaign as, at some level, a problem for others to solve. He was focused on the Pacific, where Japan had administered a humiliating blow, and he was deeply reluctant to accept guidance from the British on how to organize coastal convoy systems. The British had been offering exactly that guidance since before America entered the war. They had sent detailed proposals, offered experienced escort officers, shared the hard-won tactical knowledge of 2 years of Atlantic fighting. King received these offers with something less than enthusiasm. An organized convoy system for the American coast, he argued, required more escorts than were currently available, and a poorly organized convoy was, in his view, more dangerous than no convoy at all, since it concentrated targets in one place. This argument was not without logic, but it was applied too absolutely and held too long. The British had faced identical resource shortages in 1939 and 1940, had implemented convoy systems with whatever they had available, and had found that even weak escorts deterred attack and reduced losses significantly. The mere presence of a single escort vessel forced a U-boat to operate more cautiously, to submerge, to wait, to potentially miss its window. Unescorted ships sailing alone offered no such complication. The statistics accumulating through January and February of 1942 told the story in the coldest possible terms. The monthly losses in the Western Atlantic and American coastal zone were climbing at a rate that threatened to undo whatever progress had been made against the U-boats in the mid-Atlantic during the second half of 1941. Civilian life on the American coast was beginning to register the war in ways no official announcement had prepared people for. Bodies washed ashore on Florida beaches. Oily wreckage drifted into harbor mouths. Fishermen heading out in the early morning hours encountered life rafts, debris fields, the burn marks of fuel oil spreading across calm water. A few communities began to report the distant glow of burning tankers, visible from the shoreline at night, sometimes multiple fires at once. Local newspapers ran stories. Some were suppressed at the request of naval authorities who understood that publicizing the scale of the destruction could damage morale and provide the enemy with information about patrol patterns. The suppression was imperfect, and rumor spread what official silence tried to contain. Dönitz, watching his crew's reports arrive at Lorient, pushed to expand the operation as rapidly as possible. The 5 initial boats were proving what he had argued for years, that concentrated, aggressive submarine warfare against Allied shipping could inflict a rate of loss that the Allies could not sustain. He began cycling additional boats westward as they became available, extending the operation beyond the immediate seaboard and down toward the Florida Straits and the waters around Bermuda. Each boat that arrived in American waters found conditions almost as favorable as the first wave had reported. The defensive infrastructure was improving, slowly, incrementally. But the fundamental problem of unescorted ships sailing individually had not yet been addressed. The killing continued. By the end of the first full month of Paukenschlag, the tonnage figures compiled by the German naval staff showed losses that would have seemed implausible to predict. The rate of sinking per U-boat per day at sea in American waters was, for a period, higher than at almost any other point in the entire war. The ratio of U-boat effort to result was extraordinary, and Dönitz was not a man who failed to notice extraordinary ratios. He pressed Hitler and the German Naval High Command for more resources, more boats, more torpedoes, more fuel for his milch cow supply submarines. that would eventually allow his crews to remain at sea even longer. His argument was straightforward and brutally logical. The Americans were offering a target of unimaginable richness, and every week of delay in exploiting it was a week that could not be recovered. Inside American Naval Command, the pressure was finally beginning to overcome the institutional resistance. Churchill himself had written to Roosevelt with a directness that bordered on desperation, laying out in plain terms what the monthly loss figures meant for Britain's ability to sustain itself. The British delegation in Washington continued pressing their case for a formal coastal convoy system with experienced escorts, and slowly, against the resistance of King and others who saw it as an admission of failure, the organization began. Temporary measures were introduced. Dimute regulations for coastal cities, the use of shallow draft patrol vessels as makeshift escorts, the redeployment of some anti-submarine aircraft to coastal patrol duties. None of it stopped the killing immediately. The bureaucratic machinery of a nation transitioning from peacetime to war moved at its own ponderous pace, and the U-boats moved faster. What the German submariners operating in American waters in the winter of 1942 were experiencing, and what the Allied staffs were slowly, painfully acknowledging, was a failure of imagination on one side, meeting a precision of vision on the other. Donitz had planned for this moment. The American Navy had not. The difference was measured in ships at the bottom of the ocean and men dead in cold water, within sight of a shoreline that remained, for those first weeks, bright with an innocence the war had not yet burned away. The drumbeat Donitz had promised his commanders would sound through the darkness of the Western Atlantic, and it was the loudest and most costly that the Allies would hear all year. The Germans had a word for it. They called it the second happy time, a phrase that lands with a particular weight when you understand what the first one cost the Allies. The original happy time had come in the summer and autumn of 1940, when small numbers of U-boats had torn through convoy routes with almost nothing to stop them. Now, in the winter of 1942, history was repeating itself, but on a different coastline, against a nation that had not yet learned the brutal arithmetic of submarine warfare. For the crews of the U-boat arm, the American eastern seaboard felt less like a battlefield and more like a gift. Calm seas, clear weather, abundant targets, and an enemy still blinking in confusion. The slaughter that followed would be remembered inside the U-boat service as the freest hunting any of those men would ever know. The mechanics of that slaughter were almost embarrassingly simple. A U-boat commander approaching the American coast in those early weeks of 1942 did not need to track convoys across thousands of kilometers of open ocean. He simply needed to find a shipping lane and wait. Merchant vessels were sailing alone on predictable routes at predictable speeds, with no zigzag pattern and no escort anywhere in sight. The routes themselves were well known. Tankers running up from the Gulf of Mexico, freighters moving between Atlantic ports, ore carriers working their way down from Canada. Every one of them was vulnerable. Every one of them was essentially unprotected. A U-boat commander, positioning himself just outside a major American port, could watch the traffic move back and forth as though there were no war at all. What made it worse, what made it almost surreal, was the light. American coastal cities had not dimmed their shorelines. Resort towns, beachfront communities, the glow of cities like Miami and Jacksonville and Norfolk, all of it bled out over the water in long, pale curtains of light. For merchant sailors, this was catastrophe in luminescent form. A ship moving northward along the Florida coast at night was silhouetted perfectly against that glow, her outline sharp and readable from miles away, her course and speed easily calculated by any U-boat commander watching through a periscope or from the surface. The merchant crews knew it. They complained about it, and yet the lights stayed on for weeks, then months, because American civilian authorities were unwilling to impose blackout regulations, and local businesses feared losing tourist revenue. Men died in the glow of other people's ordinary evenings. Stand for a moment with the men on those merchant ships. Most of them were not military sailors. They were merchant mariners, civilian workers, in the eyes of their own government, employed by shipping companies to move cargo. They had no training in evasion. Their ships were built for capacity, not speed. A fully laden tanker moved through the water at perhaps 10 or 11 knots, which meant that once a torpedo was in the water, there was almost nothing the crew could do. Some men described it as a kind of helplessness that was harder to bear than outright fear, the knowledge that their survival depended almost entirely on whether a U-boat commander had chosen their ship or the one behind them. They watched the coastline glowing in the dark and understood, in a way their government apparently did not, what that light was doing to them. When a ship went down in those waters, the experience of survival was shaped by two contradictory realities. On one side, the Atlantic coast in February is cold, but not the cold of the mid-ocean in winter. Men had a better chance of surviving the water long enough to be rescued. On the other side, rescue was far from guaranteed, because there was no organized system in place to find survivors quickly. Lifeboats drifted, rafts scattered. Some men were in the water for hours before a passing vessel spotted them. Others were not spotted at all. The rescue of survivors depended on the proximity to shore, the charity of passing ships, and a great deal of luck. Word reached the port cities in fragments. A lifeboat coming in. Men landed at a fishing dock. A survivor making his way to a telephone. The losses accumulated quietly at first, and then with a volume that could no longer be ignored. Inside American Naval Command, the response was agonizing to watch. The United States Navy, still reeling from the shock of the 7th of December, 1941, was fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously, and the Atlantic coast was not its immediate priority. There were institutional reasons for the delays: insufficient escorts, competing demands for destroyers in the Pacific, a command culture that had not fully absorbed the British experience of convoy warfare. But there were also failures of imagination and pride. Senior American naval officers had been told, patiently and repeatedly, by their British counterparts what the U-boat threat required: convoy escorts, coastal blackouts, a unified anti-submarine command. The advice was not secret. It had been offered in good faith, based on 2 years of hard and painful learning, and it was not acted upon with anything like the speed the situation demanded. The British frustration during those months was barely contained. Officers who had watched their own merchant fleet bleed through 1940 and 1941 had no patience for arguments about the impracticality of convoy organization or the inadequacy of available escorts. If you did not have enough escorts, you used what you had. An imperfect convoy was better than no convoy at all. Even small numbers of escort vessels changed the calculation for a U-boat commander. The threat of a counterattack was often enough to make him turn away. Without any escorts at all, there was no calculation to make. The U-boats could simply operate on the surface, in daylight if they chose, and pick their targets at leisure. This is what was happening off the American coast, and the British knew it, and the Americans knew that the British knew it, and the organizational machinery ground forward at its own pace regardless. The tonnage figures that accumulated through the first months of 1942 were not just large numbers on a page. Each figure represented a ship, a cargo, a crew. Tankers going down with their oil burning on the water. Freighters settling under the weight of their own holds. Tall carriers rolling and disappearing in minutes. The pace of sinkings off the American coast and in the Caribbean exceeded anything Dönitz had initially hoped for. His U-boat commanders were submitting patrol reports that read, to those inside the U-boat arm, like accounts of a shooting gallery. Tonnage was being destroyed faster than American shipyards could replace it, and certainly far faster than the Allies could absorb the strategic consequences. Oil stocks in Britain began to tighten. Supplies destined for North Africa were delayed or redirected. The logistics of an entire global war were being distorted by a relatively small number of submarines, operating in waters that should, by any reasonable assessment, have been defended. The psychological pressure on merchant marine communities was beginning to show by late winter. Port cities like Halifax, Baltimore, and New York were absorbing the returning survivors, listening to their accounts, watching men who had been at sea come back. Those who came back at all, with a particular quality of silence about them. The merchant mariner who had watched his ship go down, who had spent hours in a lifeboat, who had been pulled from the water by a passing vessel, carried something afterward that did not easily translate into conversation. Families in port communities learned to read the absence of news as news of its own kind. Shipping companies struggled to crew vessels because experienced men were becoming harder to find, and some of the men who were available were becoming reluctant to sail. This was entirely rational behavior, and it was beginning to affect the one thing the entire Allied war effort depended on. Through February and March of 1942, the arguments inside American Naval Command continued. Proposals for convoy organization were met with objections about available resources. Suggestions for coastal dim-out orders faced resistance from civilian authorities. The system moved as systems do when they have not yet been shocked into urgency, by committee, by memorandum, by the kind of cautious institutional logic that functions adequately in peacetime and fails catastrophically in war. Meanwhile, on the water, the killing continued. The U-boats that had crossed the Atlantic to reach American waters were operating on patrol schedules, returning to port, being rearmed, and going back out again. The rhythm of their campaign had a relentless, clockwork quality that mocked the bureaucratic tempo of the Allied response. By the time spring arrived and the first meaningful coastal convoy system began to take shape along the American eastern seaboard, the damage was already done on a staggering scale. Hundreds of ships had been lost. The tonnage figures for the first half of 1942 would eventually be counted as among the worst the Allies suffered in the entire war. The U-boat arm had achieved in American waters something it had struggled to replicate in the mid-Atlantic, a period of near-total operational freedom, sustained not by any technical superiority on the German side, but by organizational failure on the Allied side. When the convoy system was finally implemented and began to reduce sinkings off the American coast, Dönitz simply shifted his boats elsewhere. The second happy time was over in one location, but the lesson it had written in burning ships and drowned men would take far longer to fully read. What lingered longest was not the strategic reckoning, though that was severe enough. It was the particular quality of waste embedded in those months, the sense that so many of the deaths were preventable, that the gap between the warning and the response had been measured not in weeks, but in thousands of lives. The merchant mariners who sailed through that winter had no certainty about what awaited them. They had their orders, their cargo, their courses, and the long silhouetted run along a glowing coastline toward whatever came next. Some of them made it, a great many did not. The second happy time ended without ceremony, replaced simply by the next phase of a war that had no interest in pausing to acknowledge what it had already consumed. There was a man at the center of it all, not on the ocean, not in the water, not crouched over a periscope in the freezing dark, but at a desk, in an office, in a converted French chateau near the port city of Lorient, On the Brittany coast, Admiral Karl Dönitz ran the U-boat war from that desk, with a focus that bordered on the monastic. He slept little. He read every patrol report that came in. He knew the names of his captains, knew their habits, knew which men pressed their attacks, and which ones hesitated. He had built the German submarine arm almost from nothing in the mid-1930s, trained it, shaped its doctrine, and by the early months of 1942, he had delivered it to the edge of something he had long believed was possible, a strangling of Britain through the systematic destruction of her supply lines. To understand the Battle of the Atlantic in 1942, you must first understand the man who drove it, because Dönitz did not simply command the U-boat campaign. He was its architect, its believer, and in many ways, its soul. Karl Dönitz had come to submarines through the First World War. He had served as a U-boat commander, been captured after his vessel was lost, and spent time as a prisoner of war, time he used to think, to study, to refine. What he took from that war was not bitterness alone, but a precise and clinical understanding of why the earlier German submarine campaign had fallen just short of breaking Britain. The answer, as he saw it, was coordination. Individual submarines operating alone could be tracked, evaded, and eventually sunk. But submarines operating together, as a concentrated mass, attacking simultaneously from multiple angles, that was a different problem altogether. An escort group protecting a convoy could chase one contact, but it could not be everywhere at once. Dönitz carried this idea through the interwar years, through the formal restrictions placed on German naval power, and into the 1930s, when he was quietly given the task of rebuilding what would become the Kriegsmarine's submarine fleet. He called his concept Rudeltaktik, Wolfpack tactics, and he believed it with a certainty that outlasted almost every obstacle placed before it. The Wolfpack system worked through a sequence of steps that was, at its core, elegant in its simplicity. A U-boat on patrol in the broad Atlantic was first and foremost a reconnaissance asset. Its job was not necessarily to attack immediately upon finding a convoy, but to shadow it, keeping contact, reporting position, course, and speed by radio back to Lorient. That signal went to Dönitz's operations room, where staff plotted positions on a map of the Atlantic, cross-referencing with reports from other boats and with intelligence about Allied routing. From that room, orders would go out to every available submarine within striking range, ordering them to converge on the convoy's projected position. Over hours, and sometimes days, the net would tighten. Boats that had been spread across hundreds of kilometers of ocean would close in from different directions, running on the surface when possible to make speed, diving only when threatened by aircraft or detection. By the time the pack struck, a convoy that had been guarded by 4 or 5 escorts might face 8, 10, or a dozen submarines, attacking simultaneously under cover of darkness. The timing of the attack was not incidental. Dönitz's doctrine placed particular emphasis on surface attacks at night. This was counterintuitive to many naval minds of the era, which associated submarines with submerged stealth. But Dönitz had reasoned carefully. On the surface at night, a U-boat was a low silhouette, difficult to see from a merchant ship's deck, difficult to detect by the ASDIC sonar that Allied escorts depended on, because ASDIC was designed to find submerged contacts. On the surface, a U-boat could also move fast, repositioning between attacks, firing from close range, then pulling back into the darkness before an escort could bring its weapons to bear. The night surface attack turned the U-boat from a slow, lurking underwater weapon into something more like a fast torpedo boat, aggressive, fluid, and devastatingly hard to pin down. Through the winter and into the spring of 1942, this doctrine was proving itself in the waters of the Atlantic. with a consistency that stunned even those who had believed in it. To make all of this work required something beyond doctrine. It required communication, constant, reliable, high-volume radio contact between the boats at sea and the headquarters at Lorient. Every contact report, every position update, every request for routing orders traveled through that radio link. Dönitz was, in this sense, conducting his campaign like a general directing a land battle, maintaining control over individual units across thousands of kilometers of open ocean. It was an extraordinary command achievement, and it gave the U-boat campaign a coherence and responsiveness that Allied anti-submarine forces would struggle to match for much of the year. There was a cost to this method that would only become clear later. All that radio traffic could, in theory, be intercepted and read. But in the early months of 1942, with the naval Enigma blackout still keeping Bletchley Park in the dark, that vulnerability had not yet been turned against him. The relationship between Dönitz and his crews was unlike almost anything else in the German military of that era. He called his submariners his sons, and the phrase was not entirely rhetorical. He knew that he was sending young men into conditions of extreme danger, into steel tubes that could, and did, become coffins without warning. The mortality rate in the U-boat arm, taken across the whole war, was among the highest of any military service on either side of the conflict. Dönitz understood this, and it shaped the way he led. He greeted returning crews personally when schedules allowed. He attended the funerals of those lost. He wrote to families. He made himself visible, present, and human in a way that created a bond of genuine loyalty, not simply obedience, between the admiral and the men who carried out his strategy. When a young commander brought his boat home having sunk significant tonnage, Dönitz would be there, on the dock, to shake his hand. That mattered enormously to men who had spent weeks in the darkness of the deep Atlantic. Inside the U-boat arm itself, a culture had grown up around skill and audacity. The most successful commanders became celebrated figures, awarded decorations, feted by the German press, photographed for newspapers and newsreels. There was a genuine meritocracy at the sharp edge of the campaign. Results mattered above seniority, and a young commander who proved himself aggressive and capable could find himself decorated and respected in ways that would have taken decades in other branches of the service. This created a competitive intensity among crews and captains that fed directly back into operational effectiveness. Men wanted to excel. They wanted their boat's tonnage record to grow. They wanted the recognition that came with success. Whether this culture was entirely healthy was another question. It could push commanders toward recklessness, but through the first half of 1942, it was generating results that the German naval leadership found intoxicating. By the spring of that year, the confidence inside the U-boat headquarters had reached a level that was almost difficult to contain. The American coastal slaughter of the early months had produced tonnage figures that exceeded even Dönitz's projections. Wolfpack operations in the mid-Atlantic, though not always as clean as doctrine prescribed, were continuing to extract a heavy price from convoy after convoy. The number of operational U-boats was growing as new hulls came out of the yards and new crews completed their training. Not as fast as Dönitz wanted, because he was always demanding more, always calculating that just a few dozen additional boats could tip the balance toward a decisive outcome. He had made this argument to the German naval leadership before the war. He had made it again in 1940 and 1941. The resources he needed had never fully materialized. But 1942 was beginning to feel, at least from inside Lorient, like the year in which what he had was finally enough. Dönitz worked from a principle he had put into numbers, a calculation that if Allied shipping losses could be sustained above a certain threshold per month, Britain would eventually exhaust her capacity to import the food, fuel, and raw materials necessary to remain in the war. The arithmetic was not complicated. Britain needed a certain volume of shipping to survive. The U-boats needed to sink more than Allied yards could replace, for long enough that the cumulative loss became irreversible. For much of 1942, that calculation was running in Germany's favor. Each month that losses climbed, each convoy battle that ended in burning ships and lost cargoes, moved the numbers closer to the threshold Dönitz believed would be decisive. He tracked these figures obsessively, and the figures gave him reason to believe. What he could not track with equal precision, what no one inside the Badu operations room fully appreciated in those months, was the depth of the industrial and scientific response beginning to gather on the other side. The Americans were building ships. The British were building better weapons and training better crews. Researchers and engineers on both sides of the Atlantic were working on the tools that would eventually reach into the Wolfpack's methodology and dismantle it piece by piece. But in the spring of 1942, those developments were still months away from mattering at sea. For now, the Wolfpack machine was running, and it was running well, and the man at the desk in Lorient had every reason to believe that the ocean was turning in his direction. And yet Dönitz was not a man who allowed himself the luxury of complacency. He drove his staff as hard as he drove his crews. He pushed for more boats, more fuel, more torpedoes, more training time for new commanders. He knew, perhaps better than anyone in the German High Command, that the margins in the Atlantic were thinner than the current success suggested. He had built his career on a belief that concentrated pressure, relentlessly applied, could break a maritime nation's capacity to resist. That belief was being validated in the tonnage figures that crossed his desk each morning. But he also understood that the window in which Germany held the advantage was not infinite. The Americans were awakening. Their industry was turning toward the problem. The question that dominated everything else, though it was rarely spoken aloud inside the chateau at Lorient, was whether the U-boat arm could do enough damage, quickly enough, before that awakening became overwhelming. 1942 was the year that question hung in the balance, unresolved, as deadly as the weapons being used to answer it. To understand the Battle of the Atlantic, you have to go inside it. Not the charts and the strategy rooms, not the convoy routes plotted on gridded maps by men with clean hands and dry clothes. You have to go down into the steel. A Type 5 U-boat was roughly 67 meters long and about 6.5 meters wide at its broadest point. Inside that hull lived between 40 and 50 men, sharing a space smaller than most suburban houses, for weeks or months at a time. There was no privacy. There was no silence. There was only the constant vibration of the diesels when surfaced, the eerie quiet of electric motors when submerged, and the smell, a smell that every man who served aboard one and survived described in almost identical terms. Diesel oil, sweat, mildew, unwashed bodies, and the faint metallic undertone of condensation dripping from cold steel. You could not wash it off. After a few days at sea, you stopped noticing. After a few weeks, it had become the smell of the world. The Type 7 was the workhorse of the U-boat arm, the boat that fought the Atlantic battle more than any other vessel. The Type 9 was larger, longer ranged, better suited for the distant waters the war was now pushing into. The American coast, the Caribbean, the South Atlantic. But aboard both types, the essential experience was the same. Men slept in rotation because there were not enough bunks for everyone to sleep at the same time. Junior ratings bedded down beside torpedo tubes, in spaces that were technically storage rather than quarters. Officers had marginally more space and marginally less dignity than they might have imagined when they first applied for submarine service. The commanding officer, the commandant, had a curtained alcove rather than a cabin. The curtain was the only door in the boat. Daily life aboard a U-boat on patrol had a rhythm that was partly military and partly something older, something closer to the rhythms of a fishing vessel or a sailing ship. The crew stood watch in rotation, 4 hours on and 8 hours off, though off rarely meant rest in any real sense. Maintenance was continuous. The diesels, the batteries, the torpedo mechanisms, the diving planes, the ballast systems. Everything required constant attention because everything existed at the edge of its tolerances. The food, famously, began well. Fresh bread, real meat, fruit. But within the first week, the bread grew mold. The fresh provisions were exhausted, and the crew settled into tinned food, black bread, and whatever small comforts the cook could produce from a galley barely larger than a wardrobe. Damp pervaded everything. Condensation gathered on the interior hull and dripped onto sleeping men, onto food, onto electrical equipment that had no business being wet. What held these crews together was not ideology. It was something more immediate and more durable. The knowledge that every man aboard depended absolutely on every other man. A U-boat was a machine that required its entire crew to function simultaneously, without hesitation, to survive. A slow dive was a dead dive. A torpedo tube that jammed at the wrong moment could cost a boat its attack position and potentially its life. The hierarchy was real. The commandant's authority was absolute, but it was an authority built on earned trust as much as rank. Dönitz had cultivated this culture deliberately. He knew his crews, visited them between patrols, remembered names and faces. The bond between the U-boat arm and its commander was personal, in a way that was unusual in any military organization. His men called him Der Löwe, the lion, and the name was not ironic. When the order came to attack, the boat transformed. The easy routine of a long transit vanished. The commandant was at the periscope, or, for a night surface attack, on the bridge, the wind and spray and darkness all around him. Below, the torpedo crews were at their stations. The mechanics of loading and targeting executed with the speed of men who had drilled it hundreds of times. A torpedo attack was not the explosive drama that later films would make of it. From inside the boat, it was a sequence of precise, controlled actions. The bearing, the speed estimate, the angle of deflection, the flood and pressurize of the tube, and then the hiss of compressed air or the surge of electric propulsion, and the weapon was gone. Then silence, then counting. The crew counted the seconds, knowing the approximate range, knowing what the detonation meant if it came. When it did, the sound arrived as a deep, resonant percussion through the hull, felt as much as heard. Some men would describe it as a terrible satisfaction, an acknowledgement of a job technically completed. Others said nothing at all. The other side of that exchange was the depth charge attack, and here the word terror becomes inadequate. A convoy escort that had obtained a good ASDIC contact would run in and drop its charges, and the U-boat below would be forced to sit or maneuver blindly as hundreds of kilograms of explosive sank through the water toward it. The sound of an approaching destroyer or corvette, heard through the hull, was a drumming, churning noise that grew and grew until it filled everything. The detonations, when they came, were not the cinematic rattle of distant explosions. They were concussive shocks that threw men from their footing, shattered light bulbs, cracked gauges, and bent steel if they were close enough. Water could begin to enter around valve seals. The air grew foul as the boat stayed deep, carbon dioxide rising, the crew rationing their breathing, some lying completely still to conserve oxygen. Some attacks lasted hours. A crew that survived a sustained depth charge attack had been, collectively, as close to death as it was possible to come without crossing over. The psychological toll of all this accumulated slowly and was rarely spoken of directly. The U-boat arm had one of the highest casualty rates of any branch of any military force in the war. By the time the war ended, roughly 3/4 of all men who served in U-boats would be dead. In 1942, those numbers were not yet fully visible, but every crew knew the mathematics in a general way. They knew men who had not come back. They knew boats that had simply stopped transmitting. The official culture demanded confidence, aggression, a certain performative cheerfulness between patrols. But the patrols themselves, weeks and months inside the steel, produced a particular kind of exhaustion that was not physical. Men became quieter. Their eyes changed. The veterans on a boat were recognizable, not by their age, but by something in their manner, a heaviness that the newer men had not yet acquired. Now step away from the U-boat, step back, all the way back, to the surface, to a different kind of ship entirely. The Allied merchant vessel was, in almost every respect, the opposite of the U-boat experience. Where the submarine was cramped and hidden and designed for violence, the merchant ship was large, slow, and almost defenseless, designed only to carry. A typical Liberty ship, or a pre-war tramp steamer, was crewed by men who were not, for the most part, military in any formal sense. They were merchant mariners, professional seafarers, men who had spent their working lives moving cargo across oceans. Some were veterans of multiple wars, simply by virtue of being at sea during them. They were paid wages, not military salaries. They had signed on for a voyage, not a duration. What they faced in 1942 was this: a slow convoy, perhaps 8 knots in good conditions, strung out across kilometers of ocean, often no air cover, an escort group of perhaps 5 or 6 vessels spread thin across the whole convoy perimeter, and somewhere in the dark water around them, possibly very close, boats that were specifically hunting them. The merchant sailor could not dive. He could not fight back in any meaningful sense, beyond whatever small anti-aircraft or anti-submarine armament might have been bolted to his deck. He could only sail his course, keep station in the convoy, watch the horizon, and wait. In fog or overcast, with no moon, a man on watch could see almost nothing. The first indication of a U-boat attack might be a column of fire on the far side of the convoy, or a concussion underfoot as a torpedo struck the ship immediately ahead. The men who survived a sinking and reached a lifeboat or a raft entered a different ordeal entirely. The North Atlantic in winter is a water temperature that produces incapacitation within minutes of immersion and death within an hour for a man without thermal protection. Even those who made it into lifeboats might wait many hours or longer for rescue, and rescue was not guaranteed. Convoy escorts had a brutal calculation to perform. Stopping to pick up survivors meant presenting a stationary target to any U-boat still in the area. Rescue ships were introduced specifically to carry this burden, sailing at the rear of convoys, slower and more exposed. The men they pulled from the water were sometimes burned, sometimes in shock, sometimes the only survivor from a crew of 40. They arrived aboard the rescue ships, silent, in many cases, having just watched their ship and their shipmates disappear into the Atlantic. What both sides of this war shared, in the end, was the ocean itself. The Atlantic of 1942 made no distinctions. It was cold, dark, and indifferent to the cause of any man floating on or beneath its surface. The German sailor in his pressured steel tube and the British merchant seaman in his exposed bridge wing were alike in this. They were human beings placed inside machines that the sea could kill at any moment, sustained by nothing more than training, routine, the presence of other men, and whatever private source of endurance each carried inside himself. The strategies above them, Dönitz's tonnage calculations, Churchill's shipping graphs, Roosevelt's production targets, were abstractions. The men living and dying inside the battle had no access to those abstractions. They had only the next watch, the next dive, the next dark horizon, and the hope that the next sunrise would find them still on the surface of the world. Before a single ship could sail, before a torpedo was fired or a depth charge rolled into the sea, there was paperwork. There were signals, schedules, port authorities, fuel manifests, and the quiet, grinding machinery of coordination that made the convoy system function at all. To understand why the Battle of the Atlantic hung so often by such a thin thread, you have to understand what it actually took to move a convoy across 3,000 miles of contested ocean, and how many places that system could, and regularly did, break down. The convoy was not simply a cluster of ships sailing together for comfort. It was a living military formation, governed by doctrine, shaped by chronic shortage, and held together by the judgment of men who had almost never done anything quite like this before. The process began weeks before departure, in the grey administrative offices of ports like Halifax, Nova Scotia, and later New York. Ships were allocated to convoys by type, speed, and cargo priority. Merchantmen carrying oil or ammunition were slotted into positions that balanced the formation's vulnerability. Not too many of the most explosive cargoes in the same column, not the slowest ships on the exposed flanks where a U-boat's angle of approach gave them the longest firing solution. The convoy commodore, typically a retired Royal Navy officer recalled to service, was responsible for the merchant ships themselves. He sailed aboard one of the freighters, flying his broad pennant, issuing signals by light and flag to keep his unwieldy flock in formation. He was a man of authority, without warships to command. His power lay entirely in the discipline of the merchant captains around him, and that discipline varied enormously. The escort commander was an entirely different animal. He held command over the warships tasked with protecting the convoy, the destroyers, corvettes, and frigates that formed the screen around the merchant columns. He was a fighting officer, thinking in terms of attack geometry, hydrophone ranges, and fuel states. The relationship between the convoy commodore and the escort commander was meant to be collaborative, each informing the other and working toward the same survival. In practice, the division of authority created friction that cost lives. An escort commander who needed to hunt a submerged contact might swing the convoy onto a new heading at short notice, leaving the commodore scrambling to manage 40 ships that had drilled on different evasion procedures. Communication between the two was constrained by radio silence. Every transmission risked giving away the convoy's position to German direction-finding stations, so critical decisions sometimes passed through flashing light signals across miles of heaving ocean, in the dark, under attack. The warships that formed these escort groups in 1942 were themselves a study in compromise. The workhorses of the mid-Atlantic run were the Flower-class corvettes, small, cheap vessels originally designed for coastal work, built in large numbers precisely because they could be constructed quickly in yards that could not manage larger hulls. They rolled viciously in Atlantic swells, drenched their crews in every sea state above moderate, and had a speed that barely exceeded the surface speed of a U-boat running on its diesel engines. A fully surfaced U-boat at night could outrun a corvette on certain headings, and Dönitz's crews knew it. The more capable destroyers and the newer frigates that would eventually become the backbone of the escort forces were desperately scarce through most of 1942. Many destroyers were tied up in fleet duties, in the Mediterranean, or in the increasingly urgent Pacific Theater, where American naval attention was inevitably drawn after Pearl Harbor. The men who planned convoy schedules worked in the shadow of that constant shortage, shifting vessels from one escort group to another, sometimes leaving a convoy to cross the most dangerous stretch of ocean with a screen that was simply too thin to cover every threat axis at once. The weapons these escorts carried were, in the early months of the year, frequently unequal to the task. ASDIC, the sound detection equipment used to locate submerged submarines, had real limitations in the open Atlantic. Thermal layers in the water could bend or deflect the sound beam, creating dead zones where a careful U-boat commander could lie quiet and wait out a pursuit. The standard weapon for a confirmed contact was the depth charge, a canister of high explosive rolled off the stern or thrown from side projectors, set to detonate at a calculated depth. Attacking with depth charges required an escort to pass directly over the contact and then release the charges in a pattern, during which the attacking ship actually lost contact with the submarine beneath it in the final seconds of the run. A skilled U-boat commander could exploit that gap, turning sharply, changing depth, and often escape an attack that had seemed perfectly set up. The Hedgehog, an ahead-throwing mortar that fired a spread of contact-fused bombs forward of the attacking ship so that ASDIC contact could be maintained throughout, was still arriving in service in meaningful numbers. The weapons were getting better, but slowly, and the U-boats were getting more numerous, faster than the weapons could improve. Air power over the convoys was a constant, bitter argument throughout 1942. The fundamental arithmetic was understood by almost everyone who thought seriously about the problem. A single aircraft circling a convoy could force every U-boat within visual range to dive, breaking off their attack preparations and losing contact. Aircraft sank submarines outright far less often, but their presence alone imposed a kind of safety. The problem was institutional as much as it was material. Bomber Command, under its own strategic priorities, was deeply reluctant to divert very long-range aircraft to convoy escort duties, when those same machines could be dropping bombs on German industrial targets. The debate between Naval and Air Command was not simply a matter of competing egos. It reflected genuinely difficult choices about where scarce resources would do the most good. But from the perspective of the men aboard the freighters and tankers crossing the mid-ocean gap, the argument felt unconscionable. They entered those waters beyond aircraft range, knowing that the fundamental deterrent to U-boat attack had simply been argued out of existence above their heads. The assembly of a convoy was itself a demanding and sometimes chaotic process. In Halifax Harbour, or in the anchorage off the Clyde, on the British side, ships gathered over days, some arriving late, some requiring last-minute repairs, others needing to be repositioned in the formation because their loaded drafts had changed the stability calculations. The routing conference, held aboard the Commodore's ship or in a dockside room, brought together the masters of every merchantman for a final briefing on the planned course, the emergency evasion procedures, the recognition signals, and the rendezvous instructions for any ship that became separated. These men were civilians, operating under naval direction, some of them veterans of the earlier part of the war, some of them on their first convoy crossing. They received their sealed routing orders, which gave the planned track across the ocean to be opened at sea, and then they waited for the weather window and the signal to sail. Once at sea, the convoy took up its rectangular formation, columns of ships, separated by prescribed distances, steaming together at the speed of the slowest vessel in the group. Maintaining formation in Atlantic weather tested even experienced navigators. At night, running without lights to avoid silhouetting against any illumination. Ships used small stern lights visible only at close range to keep station on the vessel ahead. A convoy stretched across miles of ocean at its full width, a vast, slow-moving target that nonetheless presented the escorts with an almost impossible perimeter to defend if multiple U-boats attacked simultaneously. The escort screen was typically spread ahead and on the flanks, with the greatest concentration in the direction from which intelligence suggested the greatest threat, which in 1942, with the Enigma blackout already descending, was increasingly a matter of educated guessing rather than reliable calculation. Command of the convoy route was divided between geographic zones, which created its own layer of complexity. The Royal Canadian Navy bore primary responsibility for convoys in the western portion of the Atlantic, the approaches to and from Halifax and the Gulf of St. Lawrence. The Royal Navy's Western Approaches Command, headquartered in Liverpool, took responsibility for the eastern end. American naval forces, newly entering the Atlantic War, with all the organizational turbulence that involved, were working to establish their own escort forces for the American seaboard approaches. The three navies operated with different doctrines, different signal procedures, and particularly in the case of the Royal Canadian Navy, which had expanded with extraordinary speed and enthusiasm, but limited time for training, very different levels of anti-submarine experience. A convoy handed over from a Canadian escort group to a British one at a mid-ocean meeting point could find itself being managed according to different tactical assumptions, with almost no transition time. The gaps between these institutional seams were gaps through which U-boats sailed. The Royal Canadian Navy's situation deserves particular acknowledgement. It had grown at a pace that left its crews proud, willing, and frequently undertrained for the specific demands of mid-ocean anti-submarine warfare. Corvettes rushed into service with inexperienced crews who had simply not had the sea time to develop the instincts and teamwork that effective escort work required. They were courageous men in difficult ships, doing work that the Royal Navy's own, most seasoned escort groups found punishing. Blaming them for losses in 1942 would miss the point entirely. The blame, if it belonged anywhere beyond the larger strategic failure to take the Atlantic battle seriously enough, lay with a system that needed more time than history was willing to give it. When the convoy commodore and the escort commander were working well together, and sometimes they were, with years of professional rapport, clear communications, and a shared grip on the tactical picture, the convoy system was genuinely formidable. Routing could divert a slow-moving formation around a known U-boat concentration. Escorts could be positioned to meet an anticipated threat axis. A merchant master who understood the evasion procedures could execute a convoy turn in darkness without losing formation coherence. In those moments, the machinery functioned with a kind of rough, improvised efficiency that was quietly impressive. The problem was that in 1942, those moments coexisted with the opposite, with crews pushed past exhaustion on back-to-back crossings, with escorts too few and too slow, with intelligence that had gone suddenly dark, with aircraft that had been allocated elsewhere, with weapons that could not quite reach far enough or fast enough. The shield existed, it was real, and it saved thousands of lives. But in the year when Germany's U-boat fleet was growing fastest and striking hardest, the shield was riddled with holes that the men behind it could see clearly and could not, yet, fully close. In the vast geography of the Atlantic Ocean, there existed a particular stretch of water that held the fate of the entire Allied war effort in its grasp. It was not marked on maps with any official designation, and no naval authority could claim to govern it. Yet by the spring of 1942, This unmarked region had become the most dangerous place on Earth for men aboard merchant ships. This was the mid-Atlantic air gap, and within its boundaries, the wolf packs would hunt with virtually no interruption. The air gap was not a natural phenomenon, but rather a consequence of the mathematical limits of aviation technology. In 1942, aircraft flying from bases in Newfoundland, Iceland, or the British Isles could extend their reach only so far westward into the ocean before fuel considerations forced them to turn back toward home. Simultaneously, aircraft launching from the eastern seaboard of the United States or from Caribbean bases could penetrate only so far eastward into the Atlantic before the same cruel logic applied. Between these two spheres of air coverage lay a band of water roughly 400 to 600 kilometers across, depending on the specific aircraft type and weather conditions. Within that gap, convoys sailed essentially blind and defenseless, visible only to the wolves beneath the surface. The vulnerability created by the air gap was not subtle or marginal. It was absolute and overwhelming. A merchant convoy could spend entire days crossing through that zone of darkness, hours stretching into what felt like eternities for the men aboard escort vessels and merchant ships alike. The escorts had their weaponry, their training, and their determination, but they were painfully aware that they were inadequate to the task of defending a convoy against a coordinated wolf pack attack conducted on the surface under cover of darkness. During daylight hours, surface attacks were far riskier for the U-boats because visibility favored the escorts. But in the dead of night, when a U-boat could barely be seen, even if one knew exactly where to look, the mathematics of naval warfare shifted decisively in favor of the submersible. The escorts possessed ASDIC detection equipment, known to the Americans as sonar, but ASDIC was effective only at relatively short ranges and was useless against a U-boat attacking from the surface at night, where the submarine presented only a knife-edge profile against the dark water. This meant that when a wolf pack found a convoy passing through the air gap, they had found a prize they could attack with impunity. There would be no aircraft roaring in from the horizon, no danger of being forced beneath the surface, where they became relatively slow and ineffective. To understand why air cover was so decisive against the U-boat threat, one must recognize the fundamental vulnerability of the submarine as a weapons platform. The U-boat was extraordinarily dangerous when it possessed the element of surprise and the ability to maneuver freely on the surface at night. But it became a radically different weapon when an aircraft appeared overhead. The moment a U-boat crew received word that an aircraft was in the vicinity, they faced a critical choice. They could attempt to evade by crash diving, but this maneuver took precious minutes, and once submerged, their speed dropped dramatically, making it nearly impossible to maintain position on a convoy whose merchant ships could plod along at roughly 8 to 12 knots. Alternatively, they could remain surfaced and try to outrun the aircraft, but a modern anti-submarine aircraft moving at speeds exceeding 300 kilometers per hour would almost certainly overtake the U-boat, which had a maximum surface speed of roughly 20 to 25 kilometers per hour. The presence of an aircraft, or even the mere possibility of one, forced the U-boat commander to make decisions based on fear rather than tactical advantage. A single aircraft, circling and watching, could prevent an entire wolf pack from concentrating its attack on a convoy. This single fact explained why the air gap represented such a crisis for the Allies and such an opportunity for the Germans. The history of why the air gap persisted through the first half of 1942 is a study in competing priorities, bureaucratic friction, and the grinding difficulties of waging war across oceans that had never been designed for anything humans could do. The Royal Air Force and the Royal Canadian Air Force both understood the air gap problem acutely, as did the United States Navy and the Army Air Forces. Yet closing the gap required resources that each service believed it needed urgently elsewhere. Long-range maritime patrol aircraft, particularly the consolidated B-17 Liberator, were in desperately short supply. The Army Air Forces wanted those aircraft for strategic bombing campaigns over Germany. The Royal Air Force wanted them for reconnaissance and for striking German naval vessels. The demands of the land war in North Africa pulled aircraft and personnel away from Atlantic maritime patrol duties. Aircraft earmarked for convoy protection were sometimes diverted to other missions, sometimes cancelled entirely in favor of more glamorous or politically important air operations. Shipping bombers from American factories to British bases took weeks of travel, and losses to accident and enemy action meant that actual aircraft arriving in theater were fewer than those that left American assembly lines. The politics of inter-service competition and the fog of war combined to ensure that the solution to the air gap problem advanced far more slowly than the urgency of the problem actually demanded. There was also the problem of range itself, which was not merely a matter of will or desire, but a physics constraint that no amount of political pressure could overcome. A consolidated B-17 Liberator, one of the most capable long-range patrol aircraft available to the Allies in 1942, carried fuel sufficient for operations roughly 1,200 kilometers from its base. Flying out and back again meant that the aircraft could operate in waters roughly 600 kilometers from the nearest airfield before fuel reserves forced a return. An aircraft stationed in Newfoundland could cover a significant portion of the Western Atlantic, but as convoys moved further eastward, they moved beyond protection. The same was true for aircraft based in Iceland or Northern Ireland. The mathematics were unforgiving. There was no magic technological solution available in 1942 that could allow aircraft to patrol the entire Atlantic gap simultaneously. The only real solution was to base aircraft closer to the problem, which meant establishing air bases on either side of the Atlantic gap, and that required diplomatic negotiations with governments that were either neutral or occupied, or otherwise politically complicated. The Portuguese government maintained control of the Azores, territory potentially valuable for air bases, but politically sensitive in a way that discouraged direct military occupation. Iceland was occupied, but its government was a complicated political situation. These diplomatic and logistical tangles seemed minor when compared to the daily reality of convoys being slaughtered in waters where no rescue was possible and no air cover could arrive in time. The U-boat commanders understood the geography of the air gap as precisely as the Allies did, and they organized their operations around exploiting it. Admiral Dönitz and his operations staff at Lorient maintained detailed knowledge of convoy routes, sailing schedules, and the limitations of Allied air cover. When scouts reported a convoy's position, the decisions about which U-boats to commit and how to coordinate their attack factored in whether the target was within the air gap or still under air protection. Convoys departing from New York or other American ports that were still within range of land-based aircraft received a degree of protection, though often inadequate. Convoys approaching the eastern shores of the Atlantic and entering the range of British or Canadian air cover also faced reduced risk. But the convoys transiting the air gap, the ones that spent 2 or 3 or 4 days completely beyond the horizon of any friendly aircraft, those were the ones that the wolf packs hunted with particular intensity. The German naval operations staff would calculate the position of a convoy at the moment it entered the air gap and relay this information to waiting U-boats. The scouts would seek to maintain contact, often through the day while submerged and watching. then surface at night to close in and report the convoy's position to headquarters. The concentration of U-boats around a convoy in the air gap during the long Atlantic nights of early 1942 took on the quality of a predatory convergence. There would be no interference from the air. There would be no aircraft to drive them down. The convoy was alone. The experience of a merchant sailor aboard a freighter or tanker passing through the air gap during this period carried a quality of existential vulnerability that was difficult to convey in mere statistics. The man standing watch on deck, or below, in the engine room, knew that for the next 2 or 3 days, there would be no aircraft visible, no hope of rapid rescue if his ship was struck, no possibility of air support if an action against German surface raiders or U-boats occurred. The convoy would be traveling in formation, with dozens or scores of merchant vessels arranged in a carefully ordered grid, each ship maintaining position relative to its neighbors. The escort vessels would be positioned around the perimeter of this formation, typically fewer than a dozen warships protecting 50 or more merchants. On the surface of the water, the convoy presented a target impossible to miss. Below the surface, the U-boats waited and watched and prepared to strike. The nights in the Atlantic during this period were long, especially as the season progressed from winter towards summer. A U-boat could surface near a convoy at dusk and, in the gathering darkness, begin to position itself for an attack that would be launched around midnight or in the early hours before dawn. The explosions, when they came, would tear open the hulls of merchant ships. The fires would bloom against the black sky. The men aboard the escort vessels would see the tracery of defensive gunfire, would hear the depth charges detonating as they tried to drive away the U-boats, would watch helplessly as merchant ships went down. And yet there was no possibility of calling in air support, no possibility of having an aircraft arrive overhead within the critical minutes when the attack was actually happening. By the time any aircraft could possibly arrive, the action would be over, the U-boats would have escaped or been destroyed, and the survivors would be struggling in the water. The political and bureaucratic effort to close the air gap was real, but inadequate throughout 1942. The British pressed the Americans for more long-range patrol aircraft. The Americans pressed their own services to prioritize Atlantic convoy protection over other missions. Discussions were held about the possibility of basing aircraft in Iceland or establishing new bases in Newfoundland. Plans were drawn up for expanding the capacity of existing air stations to accommodate more squadrons. Yet each of these initiatives moved with the speed of bureaucracy and logistics, which is to say slowly. Aircraft that were promised did not always arrive. Bases that were supposed to be expanded faced unexpected delays in construction or supply. Squadrons were committed to convoy protection and then diverted to other tasks. The U-boat war did not wait for bureaucratic timelines to resolve themselves. While governments debated and military services negotiated over resource allocation, the wolves continued to hunt in the air gap. The sinkings continued, the tonnage losses mounted, and the fundamental strategic crisis facing the Allies, that their sources of supply from North America were being systematically interdicted by German submarines in waters where no defense could be mounted, remained unresolved. By the middle of 1942, the air gap had become the central defining feature of the Atlantic campaign. It was not that the air gap had created the U-boat threat. That threat had existed long before and would continue long after the gap was finally closed. Rather, the air gap had become the geographic expression of the underlying strategic asymmetry that favored the submarines during this particular year. The Allies were outnumbered in escort vessels. Their anti-submarine weapons were inadequate. Their training was improving, but still uneven. Their intelligence had been partially blinded by the 4-rotor Enigma machine. All of these problems were genuine, and would have to be addressed through industrial production, technological innovation, and hard-won experience. But above all of these factors loomed the simple geographic reality that vast stretches of the Atlantic Ocean were beyond the reach of friendly air power, and in those waters, the U-boats were lords. Every merchant convoy that departed from America, heading toward Britain or other Allied destinations, faced the almost certain probability that it would spend days in the air gap. Every escort commander knew that during those days, the convoy was fundamentally vulnerable. Every merchant sailor knew that if his ship was hit during those nights in the gap, rescue would be distant and uncertain. This knowledge shaped the psychology of the convoy battles in 1942 in ways that were not always captured in official reports or strategic assessments, but which were felt with absolute intensity by every man at sea. The solution to the air gap problem would ultimately require three separate and converging developments. First, there was the need to produce enough very long-range aircraft to allow continuous coverage across the entire Atlantic. This was primarily an American production problem, one that would be addressed through the industrial mobilization examined in later chapters. Second, there was the need to develop new technologies that would allow aircraft to locate and attack submerged or partially submerged U-boats with greater effectiveness. The radar sets being developed and refined during 1942 would eventually make a decisive contribution here. And third, there was the requirement to establish new bases or extend existing bases so that aircraft could be positioned to cover the gap from both the eastern and western shores of the Atlantic. This was partly a technological challenge and partly a diplomatic and logistical one. None of these solutions could be implemented quickly. None of them could be realized in 1942. This meant that the air gap, with all of its implications for U-boat hunting success and Allied convoy vulnerability, would persist throughout the rest of the year. The strategic consequence was that the year 1942 would be a year when the U-boats held the advantage. They could concentrate their forces against convoys in the air gap with minimal risk of air interference. They could attack at will through the long Atlantic nights, launch their attacks, and withdraw or reposition for another blow. The escorts would fight back with the weapons available to them, often with considerable bravery and tactical skill, but they would be fighting with insufficient numbers and incomplete information in waters where no help from above could possibly arrive in time to affect the outcome. The air gap also reflected something more fundamental about the nature of modern warfare as it was developing in 1942. The Atlantic Campaign was a war in which multiple dimensions of conflict intersected constantly. There was the direct combat between submarines and surface escorts, the clash of U-boats and merchant ships, the tactical exchanges that happened on specific nights at specific coordinates in the ocean. But there was also the industrial war, the competition between shipbuilding and sinkings, which was being measured in tonnage and production schedules. There was the intelligence war, the effort to read the enemy's codes and prevent the enemy from reading yours, happening in offices and listening stations far from the ocean itself. And there was the logistics war, the argument about where resources should be allocated and how military forces should be prioritized. The air gap was where all of these wars intersected. It was a geographic expression of an industrial capacity that did not yet exist, a technological limitation that could be overcome only through engineering advances that would take months to realize, and a strategic vulnerability that could not be remedied quickly through tactical excellence alone. The wolves ruled in the air gap not because they were invincible, but because, in 90, while the U-boats prowled the surface of the Atlantic, hunting with their eyes and their torpedoes, another battle raged in the shadows, a battle fought not with steel or explosives, but with mathematics, psychology, and the stubborn refusal of brilliant minds to accept that any code was unbreakable. This was the intelligence war, and it ran as deep and as consequential as the submarine campaign itself. The men and women working in the concrete bunkers of Bletchley Park in Buckinghamshire understood something that very few Allied leaders fully grasped. Whoever read the enemy's mail would likely win the Atlantic. They did not wear uniforms into battle. They did not hear the roar of diesel engines or feel the shock of depth charges. Yet their work, and their failures, determined whether convoys crossed safely or sailed into the waiting jaws of wolf packs, coordinated by radio signals they could not intercept or decode. When the war began, the British had already begun cracking the German Enigma cipher, that seemingly impenetrable machine that encoded every military message with a mathematical elegance that the Germans believed made their communications absolutely secure. The Polish had given the British an Enigma machine itself before the invasion, and brilliant minds at Bletchley Park, including the mathematician Alan Turing, had built mechanical and electromechanical devices called bombs to test possible rotor settings and recover the daily keys. By 1941, Bletchley Park was reading German naval traffic with increasing confidence, and this intelligence was flowing back to the Admiralty in London. The commanders of convoys, the senior escort officers, the route planners in Western Approaches Command, they were receiving intelligence summaries, some derived from broken Enigma traffic, that told them where the U-boats were concentrating, when wolf packs were forming, and which routes might be safer. It was not perfect. The time lag between encryption and decryption sometimes meant the intelligence arrived too late to redirect a convoy, but it was invaluable, and it gave the Allies something close to an asymmetric advantage in an Atlantic campaign they were otherwise losing. Then, in early 1942, that advantage evaporated overnight. The German Navy, aware that British naval forces had been operating with an uncanny knack for avoiding their concentrations, made a decision that would reverberate across the Atlantic for the next 10 months. They introduced a fourth rotor to the naval Enigma machine, a change that seemed technically simple, but which multiplied the number of possible daily settings from thousands to millions. To the codebreakers at Bletchley Park, it meant that the accumulated knowledge, the refined techniques, and the mechanical bombs they had built were no longer sufficient. The machine that had been, if not transparent, then at least readable, became once again opaque. The blackout was sudden, total, and catastrophic. From February 1942 onwards, the decryption rate for German naval Enigma plummeted. Where the codebreakers had been reading messages with a delay of hours or a day or two, they now could not read them at all. The Enigma had not changed its character. It had simply been made immeasurably harder. Turing and his colleagues understood the theoretical problem instantly. Finding the solution would take months of grinding, desperate work against an opponent that did not know they were even trying. The timing of this blackout cannot be separated from the catastrophe unfolding in the Atlantic. The very weeks when German naval communications became unreadable to the Allies coincided almost precisely with the beginning of Operation Paukenschlag and the opening of the American Coastal Waters Campaign. The U-boats that stalked the shipping lanes off New York, off the Carolinas, off Florida, and in the Caribbean waters were operating not in the blind, but in the light. The German B-Dienst, Germany's signals intelligence service, was reading the Allied convoy codes with steady success. They knew where convoys were assembling, the dates they would sail, the routes they would follow, and often they knew the composition and the escort strength. This was an intelligence asymmetry that ran in the opposite direction from what the Allies had enjoyed just weeks before. While the British codebreakers sat in their bunkers, frustrated and working 18-hour days to rebuild their penetration of Enigma, the German U-boat command at Lorient was receiving routing intelligence that allowed them to position their boats with precision. The U-boats that attacked the tanker Esso Baton off the Florida coast, the freighters that burned off the Outer Banks of North Carolina, the merchant ships that went down in the warm waters of the Caribbean, many of those attacks were not lucky encounters. They were coordinated against targets whose positions and movements had been forecast. Intelligence had guided the hunters to their prey. The men at Bletchley Park could not have known the full extent of this intelligence defeat because they were focused on a different but equally urgent problem. With the fourth rotor introduced to naval Enigma, they needed to not only rebuild their theoretical understanding of the machine, but also find ways to mechanically and mathematically process vastly more possible combinations than their existing bombs could handle. Some of the codebreakers, including Turing himself, proposed designs for new, faster bombs. Others worked on the pure mathematics of the problem, searching for recurring patterns or mathematical shortcuts that might reduce the search space. The American codebreakers at OP 2020, the Navy's Signals Intelligence Division in Washington, worked in parallel, pursuing different methodological approaches. But the simple truth was that there was no quick solution. The blackout continued month after month. Convoys sailed in February, March, April, May of 1942, with their route plans and sailing dates largely unknown to the codebreakers. The routing had to be based on older intelligence, on tactical assumptions, on the judgment of experienced officers who had to guess where the U-boats might be concentrating. Sometimes those guesses proved right. Often, they proved catastrophically wrong. The consequences rippled through the Atlantic campaign in ways that were rarely made explicit, but were deeply felt by those making the decisions. The convoy commodore receiving orders to sail from Halifax or from the assembly port in the United Kingdom no longer had the benefit of recent intelligence about U-boat positions. The senior escort commander, preparing his anti-submarine tactics, did not know which boats he was actually facing or where they might be concentrated. The routing officers at Western Approaches Command, plotting the daily path of a convoy across the Atlantic, did not have the intelligence that might have warned them of a wolf pack assembling ahead of the route. They were operating in a fog, and U-boats were operating, through the German intelligence advantage, in comparative clarity. The monthly tonnage losses that climbed through the spring and early summer of 1942 were partly a function of the scale of the U-boat threat itself, but they were partly also a function of this intelligence imbalance. No one in the Allied command structure could have quantified precisely how much of the disaster was attributable to the loss of Enigma access versus how much was the product of German tactical superiority or Allied tactical failure. But the loss was real, and its weight pressed down on every decision made about convoy routing and tactics throughout those months. The German Navy did not understand exactly what had happened on the other side of the Atlantic, but they understood the essential fact: their new Enigma rotor was working. The U-boat command at Lorient, under the direct authority of Admiral Dönitz, was receiving the routing intelligence from the B-Dienst, and convoy after convoy was being intercepted. Dönitz, a man of supreme confidence in his U-boat arm, interpreted this success not as evidence of an intelligence advantage, but as proof that his wolf pack tactics were devastating, and that the Allies simply could not protect their convoys. He did not know that his boats were being guided to their targets by broken Allied codes. He believed, instead, that the tactical system he had designed, the coordination of multiple boats, the night surface attack, the saturation of convoy defenses, was so effective that no amount of escorting could stop it. This conviction would shape his decisions throughout the remainder of 1942. and into 1943. He began calling for more U-boats, arguing that if Germany could sustain this level of sinkings, the Allies would be broken. The British and American governments, unable to read his intentions because they could not read his mail, did not know that Dönitz's confidence was partly an illusion created by intelligence advantage. They only knew that the losses were catastrophic and climbing. The work at Bletchley Park during these months was a grinding exercise in theoretical brilliance, applied against a problem that refused to yield to brilliance alone. The bombs had to be rebuilt or redesigned to handle the larger search space created by the fourth rotor. New machines were being constructed, but machines take time to build, test, and deploy. The codebreakers pursued parallel approaches, looking for daily pattern vulnerabilities in the Enigma setup, hoping that human operators would make mistakes that created exploitable patterns, and analyzing the structure of the German language and military communications for linguistic patterns that might narrow the search space. They also worked to exploit a critical vulnerability of the Enigma machine itself. The machine never encoded a letter as itself. The operator pressing the A key could never produce an A in the output. This seemingly small limitation was something that the codebreakers could use to eliminate certain possibilities from the search space. These refinements, accumulated through months of theoretical work and incremental breakthroughs, slowly began to improve the situation. By the summer of 1942, months after the blackout began, Bletchley Park was beginning to read German naval Enigma again, though not with the speed or consistency they had enjoyed before. The fourth rotor had not remained a permanent barrier, but the months of darkness had already contributed to the catastrophe in the Atlantic. The contrast between the world of intelligence failure and the world of operational reality was absolute and haunting. While the codebreakers worked in their bunkers, the merchant ships burned on the surface of the Atlantic. While the bombs clicked and whirred, processing possible rotor settings, convoy commodores made the decisions about which routes to sail and whether to stop for survivors. The intelligence war, fought with mathematics and technology, had a direct human cost measured in ships sunk and men drowned. The crew of the tanker being attacked in the Caribbean did not know that the German U-boat hunting them had been guided to their position by a broken Allied code. The merchant sailor pulling a lifeboat through cold Atlantic water did not understand that his situation, whether rescue came or whether he drifted until hypothermia claimed him, was partly determined by decisions made in Bletchley Park months before. The codebreakers understood this weight in the abstract. They knew that intelligence failure meant convoy losses, and convoy losses meant deaths, but they could not see the faces of the men dying. They could only work and wait and hope that the mathematics would yield before too much more blood was spilled. The German B-Dienst, for their part, operated with less subtlety, but with considerable effectiveness during the months when Bletchley Park was blind. They were reading the Allied convoy codes with a regularity that would have astonished the Allies had they known. The routing information, the sailing dates, the ship compositions, the escort arrangements. These flowed back to Lorient with remarkable consistency. The German intelligence officers could look at the decoded Allied signals and see where the convoys would be on any given day. This intelligence was passed to Dönitz and his operations staff, who would order U-boats to position themselves on the convoy routes. The coordination was not always perfect. Weather, mechanical breakdowns, and the simple uncertainties of naval operations meant that intelligence-guided intercepts did not always result in successful attacks. But the statistical advantage was clear. Convoys were being found and attacked at a rate far higher than chance alone would explain. The Germans were confident, and confident with reason. They believed they were winning because, at that moment, and in that specific intelligence dimension, they were. As spring turned to summer, and summer turned to autumn, the situation at Bletchley Park slowly changed. The combination of improved bombs, the incremental theoretical breakthroughs, the exploitation of German operator errors, and the sheer persistence of brilliant minds working impossible hours began to pay dividends. By late autumn of 1942, Bletchley Park had largely restored its ability to read German naval enigma, though not with the speed of the pre-February period. The pendulum of the intelligence war began to swing back towards the Allies. But those months of blackout, February through November, had already extracted their price. The tonnage lost during that period had been mountainous. The convoy battles fought in the shadow of an intelligence disadvantage had shaped the calendar of 1942 and left marks that would take years to fully understand. When historians would later analyze the Atlantic campaign, they would focus primarily on the U-boats, the convoys, the tactics, the technology. Few would fully grasp the extent to which an invisible battle, fought with mathematics and rotor settings, had determined the outcome of battles fought on the surface with ships and men. The intelligence war was the war beneath the war, and in 1942, it had nearly broken the Allies. The lesson that would emerge from this year of darkness was subtle but profound. In modern warfare, information had become as critical as firepower. The ability to read the enemy's communications could compensate for tactical disadvantage, or it could exaggerate tactical advantage into something approaching invulnerability. The Germans had understood this in their concentration of B-Dienst resources and in their confidence in the security of Enigma. The Allies, by the end of 1942, were beginning to understand it too. The investment in code breaking, the recruitment of mathematicians and logicians, the construction of increasingly powerful machines. These were not peripheral efforts. They were central to the war itself. As the year drew to a close and Bletchley Park began to read German naval traffic again with increasing reliability, the codebreakers knew they had barely survived a crisis that almost no one in the outside world even knew had occurred. The U-boats would continue to hunt in 1943, but they would hunt against an opponent that, once again, could read their mail. That intelligence advantage would prove, in the end, to be as important as any torpedo or depth charge fired across the Atlantic. As the spring of 1942 unfolded across the Atlantic, the war that had begun with scattered attacks on poorly defended shipping was becoming something far more organized and terrifying. The U-boat arm, under Admiral Dönitz, had learned and adapted with brutal efficiency. Where the winter months had seen lone hunters taking what targets they could find along the American coast, the spring brought coordinated wolf packs, operating with precision, that suggested not mere opportunism, but systematic strategy. The boats were no longer seeking easy targets in well-lit waters. They were now hunting the convoys themselves, the organized columns of merchant ships that represented the only lifeline keeping Britain fed and armed. What made this shift so dangerous was not merely the increase in numbers, but the emergence of what the Germans called Rudeltaktik, a coordinated pack system refined through experience, enforced by radio discipline from headquarters, and executed by crews who had learned to work together across the dark surface of the Atlantic with almost mechanical coordination. The men directing this campaign from the submarine pens at Lorient and other U-boat bases were racing against time with an urgency that only they fully understood. Intelligence officers in the German Naval Command had begun to recognize, with a clarity that haunted their calculations, that American industrial capacity would eventually overwhelm the U-boat threat through sheer numerical superiority. But if the U-boats could inflict sufficient damage on Allied shipping in 1942, If they could sink tonnage faster than even American shipyards could replace it, the mathematics of attrition might still favor Germany. This was the calculation that drove the campaigns of spring. It was not blind optimism, but rather a cold assessment that the window of opportunity was closing. Dönitz himself believed that the U-boat could still win the Atlantic War, but only if the effort were concentrated, sustained, and executed with the kind of coordination that transformed individual hunting boats into a coordinated weapon system. The convoys sailing in March and April of 1942 were about to encounter the results of this philosophy. The convoy battles of spring 1942 unfolded with a pattern that began to repeat itself with nightmarish regularity. A slow convoy, heavily laden with supplies and fuel for Britain, would depart from an assembly point in Halifax or New York. The escort group would form around it, sometimes numbering only a handful of destroyers and corvettes, far fewer than the convoy required. The ships would sail outbound toward the mid-Atlantic air gap, that vast stretch of ocean where land-based aircraft could not reach, where the convoys belonged entirely to the U-boats and to their own resources. As the convoy entered the danger zone, the radio watch aboard the escort commander's vessel would intensify. Every man aboard every ship in that formation knew what was coming. The merchant sailors, crowded below decks in their cargo holds and engine rooms, could feel the tension transmitted through the officers and warrant officers who moved through their vessels with rehearsed purpose. The convoy would sail by day in formation, the ships arranged in neat columns, separated by carefully calculated distances, attempting to present as small a silhouette as possible while maintaining the cohesion necessary for mutual defense. Then the U-boat would find them. It was almost always a lone boat, the Scout, making radio contact with headquarters at Lorient. The Scout would maintain contact while remaining beyond the range of the convoy's escorts, using the darkness to conceal itself while reporting position, course, speed, and composition. Back at Lorient, the operations staff would receive this information and begin sending out the signal. Come this way, convoy bearing, assemble. The word would crackle across the Atlantic in shortwave radio transmissions to other U-boats within striking distance. Within hours, sometimes over the course of a full day, additional submarines would begin converging on the reported position. Some would be in the mid-Atlantic already, having sailed from France weeks earlier. Others would divert from other hunting grounds. What emerged from the coordination was not a random scatter of boats, but something approaching a carefully orchestrated formation, a pack operating according to doctrine, each boat understanding its role, each captain knowing that success depended on coordination rather than individual glory. The wolf pack concept transformed the Atlantic into something resembling a chessboard, where pieces were moved by radio from distant headquarters, and where the outcome of a single engagement could involve dozens of vessels spread across miles of ocean. The attack itself, when it came, invariably came at night. This was doctrine, German doctrine refined through months of practice and casualty reports. A U-boat on the surface was faster than most merchant ships and could maneuver with greater agility than large cargo vessels, but it remained vulnerable to ramming and to the deck guns that some convoy ships carried. Submerged, the U-boat was slower and could not sustain attacks across a wide front. The solution was to attack at night when the surface visibility was limited, when the U-boat's small silhouette merged with the darkness, and when the convoy's merchant sailors and escorts labored under the handicap of near-total blindness. Multiple U-boats would position themselves along the anticipated course of the convoy, each captain timing his approach, each waiting for the signal to attack. The attack itself was brutally simple. At point-blank range, often from a distance of fewer than 1,000 meters, The U-boats would fire their torpedoes directly into the columns of merchant ships. The goal was not necessarily to sink every target, but to create chaos, to scatter the convoy formation, to overwhelm the escorts with multiple simultaneous targets, and to allow the U-boats to surface and attack, again and again, throughout the night. The experience of a torpedo strike aboard a merchant ship was terror distilled to its most primal form. The men of the merchant marine, the ordinary sailors and officers who crewed the cargo vessels, had volunteered or had been conscripted into one of the most dangerous occupations available to them. Many had already survived one sinking. Some had survived multiple. They crowded below decks because that was their duty station, working the engines or the holds, essentially blind to the world above them. When a torpedo struck, the impact was often not immediately fatal, but the effect was catastrophic. A ship that had been running at 8 or 9 knots would shudder, metal screaming against metal, compartments collapsing inward as the hull was torn open by the force of the explosion. Fire would erupt from fractured fuel lines. Water would pour in through the rupture, filling the lower decks in minutes. The men below would scramble for ladders and companionways, their eyes wide with the knowledge that only a few minutes separated them from drowning. Those who reached the deck would find their ship listing, her cargo shifting, the lifeboats already being lowered in a desperate race against time. Some ships went down so quickly that the lifeboats never made it into the water. Others remained afloat for hours, burning, attracting new attacks. As the U-boats circled and fired again, the escorts, watching from the edges of the convoy formation, were largely helpless to prevent this carnage. When a ship was hit, when the flare of the explosion lit the night sky, the escort commanders faced an agonizing series of decisions that had no good answers. Should they break formation to hunt the U-boat that had just attacked, potentially leaving the rest of the convoy exposed to other boats? Should they attempt to rescue survivors from the water, breaking formation again, and possibly exposing their own vessels to attack? Or should they remain in station, protecting the remaining ships, while men burned in the water and sank beneath the waves? Most of the time, the escort commanders chose to stay in formation. This was the doctrine, the professional judgment born from bitter experience, that the only way to save most of the convoy was to abandon the impossible task of saving those already lost. The psychological toll of these decisions was immense. Experienced officers who made these choices carried the weight of them for the rest of their lives, remembering the faces of men they had seen in lifeboats, understanding with perfect clarity that their duty and their humanity had come into direct conflict, and that duty had to prevail. The convoy battles of spring 1942 produced losses that began to exceed anything the Allies had previously experienced. In March alone, more than 380,000 tons of Allied merchant shipping were sunk. In April, the figure climbed to more than 405,000 tons. In May, it would reach the catastrophic total of more than 430,000 tons. These were not abstract figures. Each number represented a ship, and each ship represented a crew. Some convoys lost 1 or 2 vessels. Others lost far more. One convoy in March, SC-25, lost multiple ships to coordinated U-boat attacks. Another, ON-84, suffered similar devastating losses in May. The pattern repeated across the ocean, with the regularity of the tides. A convoy would sail. U-boats would find it. The attack would come at night. Ships would burn and sink. Survivors would cling to lifeboats. And the next convoy would depart, sailing into waters that were becoming progressively more lethal with each passing month. In London, Winston Churchill received daily reports on these losses, with a growing sense of alarm that approached desperation. Churchill had lived through wars, and had commanded warships himself. He understood maritime strategy and naval tactics with a sophistication that few political leaders could match. What he saw in the spring figures from the Atlantic filled him with a terror that was not abstract or theoretical, but deeply personal and rooted in his understanding of history. He began to confess, in private correspondence and in conversations with his war cabinet, that the Atlantic battle might be the war itself. If the U-boats could sink ships faster than the Allies could build them, if the tonnage losses continued to climb at the current rate, then Britain would slowly be starved of the supplies necessary, not merely to fight, but to survive. The Allies could win every battle on land and still lose the war in the Atlantic through simple mathematical attrition. This was not paranoia or pessimism, but rather a clear-eyed assessment of the strategic mathematics. Churchill wrote that the only thing that really frightened him was the U-boat peril. This was not the kind of statement that the Prime Minister made lightly. The crisis was compounded by the fact that the Allies remained partially blind. The intelligence officers at Bletchley Park, who had provided crucial advantages in decrypting German naval communications in 1941, found themselves largely locked out of the four-rotor Enigma machine that Germany had introduced in February of 1942. For months, they would labor in near total darkness regarding U-boat movements and intentions. In the absence of this intelligence, the routing of convoys became increasingly problematic. Convoy commanders would sail into areas that they did not know were already being covered by wolf packs. The U-boats, by contrast, maintained excellent intelligence through their own decryption of Allied convoy codes. German B-Dienst operators were reading many of the British and American messages describing convoy composition, routing, and escort arrangements. The asymmetry was devastating. The U-boats knew where the convoys were coming. The convoys were sailing blind into carefully prepared ambushes. What emerged from the convoys' battles of spring 1942 was not a clear direction, but rather a moment of extreme crisis that seemed to have no resolution in sight. The U-boats continued to grow in number and confidence. The wolf pack tactics were being refined through experience. The escorts were beginning to develop new weapons and new techniques, but these innovations remained inadequate to stem the losses. American shipbuilders were producing new Liberty ships at an increasing rate, but even the extraordinary capacity of American industry seemed barely adequate to replace the tonnage being sunk. In the War Cabinet in London and in the naval headquarters in Washington, the men responsible for prosecuting the war understood that they were in a race with time and with mathematics. The outcome of this race would shape the entire course of the Second World War. If the U-boats won, if they could continue to sink merchant ships faster than they could be replaced, then Germany might yet achieve something approaching victory, not through military genius or overwhelming force, but simply through the patient accumulation of losses in the dark waters of the Atlantic. As the spring turned towards summer, as the days lengthened and May became June, the magnitude of the crisis became impossible to ignore or minimize. The tonnage losses of 1942 were already approaching levels that would be unsustainable if they continued through the winter. Naval planners in both Britain and America began to contemplate outcomes that they had previously considered impossible. What if the U-boats could not be stopped? What if the Atlantic could not be held? The ships that would carry the invasion force that eventually liberated Europe did not yet exist. But if the U-boats continued their current rate of sinking, would those ships ever be built? Would the supply lines that fed the British factories and armies survive long enough for the Allies to mass the resources necessary for offensive operations? These were not theoretical questions, but rather the pressing concerns of men who understood that the spring of 1942 represented the crisis point in the entire Atlantic campaign. The darkness over the ocean was not going to lighten without a dramatic change in Allied capability, doctrine, or luck. That change would come, but not yet. For now, the convoys sailed into the spring nights, knowing what awaited them, and the U-boats waited in the darkness, coordinating through radio signals, assembling into packs, preparing to strike with the systematic efficiency of a predator that had finally discovered prey it could consume faster than the prey could reproduce. As the Atlantic darkened through the first half of 1942, as convoy after convoy vanished beneath the waves and the tonnage ledger climbed toward catastrophe, an entirely different kind of war was beginning in the shipyards of America. While U-boats hunted in wolf packs beneath the surface, while merchant sailors froze in lifeboats and admirals in London wrestled with the mathematics of survival, something unprecedented was taking shape on the Pacific and Atlantic coasts of the United States. The answer to the tonnage crisis would not come from convoy escorts or improved depth charges, or codebreakers cracking enemy signals. It would come from steel and rivets, from the massive mobilization of American industrial capacity, and from the stubborn determination of one man to build ships faster than Germany could sink them. That man was Henry Kaiser, a 58-year-old industrialist with no shipbuilding experience whatsoever, and his weapon would be the Liberty ship, a vessel so plain, so utilitarian, and so profoundly unglamorous that few would remember it as one of the essential tools of Allied victory. The problem had been clear since the beginning of the war in Europe. A modern merchant vessel took between 18 and 24 months to build, using conventional methods, with each ship requiring thousands of individual craftsmen, months of meticulous welding, and assembly lines that depended on precision and experience. The British, with their centuries of shipbuilding tradition and their desperate need for replacement tonnage, were producing perhaps 100 ships per year across their entire industry. It was not enough. American yards, even after the United States entered the war, were locked into similar timescales and methods. In early 1942, as the U-boat offensive reached its crescendo and losses mounted into millions of tons, American naval authorities realized they faced a simple, brutal arithmetic. They were losing ships faster than they could build them. Unless that equation reversed, Britain would starve. The American war economy, vast as it was, would face a strategic defeat, not in the factories, but on the ocean floor. Into this crisis stepped the Maritime Commission and a visionary named Rear Admiral Emery Scott Land, who understood that conventional shipbuilding could never produce tonnage at the scale the crisis demanded. The Commission issued specifications for a new design, deliberately simplified, stripped of all unnecessary complexity, built from a standardized set of components that could be manufactured separately and assembled with minimal skilled labor. They called it the Liberty ship. It was not beautiful. It was not particularly modern, even by 1942 standards. It was a 10,000-ton cargo vessel with a maximum speed of roughly 10 knots, the bare minimum needed for convoy work, with modest armament and no frills whatsoever. To experienced shipbuilders, the Liberty seemed like a throwback, a merchant vessel from an earlier era. What they did not understand was that simplicity was the entire strategy. The Liberty ship had been designed from the ground up, not for elegance or performance, but for speed of production. Every design decision served that single objective. Every component, every weld, every rivet existed for one purpose: to make the ship as quickly and as cheaply as possible. Henry Kaiser seized on the Liberty design with almost evangelistic zeal. Kaiser had made his fortune in heavy construction and concrete work. He had built dams and highways and bridges. He approached industrial production with the mentality of a civil engineer rather than a craftsman. He believed that shipbuilding was not some ancient art requiring decades of apprenticeship, but a problem to be solved through organization, standardization, and the relentless application of efficiency. He believed that if you could build a dam, you could build a ship, and that the principles of prefabrication and assembly line production that had transformed automobile manufacture could revolutionize shipbuilding. When the Maritime Commission asked him to take on Liberty ship contracts, Kaiser did not hesitate. In 1941, he established the West Coast shipyards, massive facilities at Richmond, California, and elsewhere along the Pacific, and turned his full attention to the problem of building Liberty ships faster than anyone thought possible. What Kaiser understood, and what separated his approach from conventional shipbuilding, was the power of prefabrication. Rather than building a ship as one integrated structure, from keel to superstructure, Kaiser's yards manufactured components separately, entire sections of hull, complete engine rooms, fully equipped deck houses, and then brought them together for final assembly. Parts were built to extremely tight standardized specifications, so they would fit together without significant adjustments. Workers specialized in their specific tasks, rather than being trained as general craftsmen. A riveter became expert at riveting. A welder concentrated solely on welding. A crane operator handled the precise placement of massive sections. This assembly line approach, which seemed almost radical when applied to shipbuilding, allowed Kaiser to employ workers with minimal training, rather than requiring the years of apprenticeship that traditional shipbuilding demanded. It made him less dependent on a scarce pool of experienced craftspeople, and more dependent on the ability to hire, train, and organize vast numbers of workers. The workforce that poured into Kaiser's shipyards was unlike anything American industry had seen before. Word spread across Depression-ravaged America that shipyard work offered steady wages and steady employment. Men from Appalachia and the Great Plains, still scarred by the economic devastation of the 1930s, found their way to California. Women, initially restricted to clerical and support roles but desperately needed as the labor shortage deepened, began working on the assembly lines themselves. Black workers, facing rigid segregation and discrimination, but motivated by steady paychecks and the propaganda of the war effort, came by the thousands. By 1943, Kaiser's Richmond Yard alone employed roughly 25,000 workers, and they came from every corner of the country. They were riveters and welders, women and men, black and white and Mexican, all of them working side by side on the same massive project. The shipyards themselves became microcosms of a new America, though one where racial segregation remained enforced in many facilities, and where women were often relegated to the most dangerous work. The pace Kaiser demanded was almost inhuman. Workers operated in shifts that ran around the clock. The yards blazed with light, even in darkness. Riveting teams worked in rhythm, one man holding the rivet, another bucking it with a hammer, creating a sound that became the audio signature of American industrial mobilization. Kaiser introduced new tools and techniques constantly, always looking for ways to shave hours off the construction time. He paid attention to ergonomics before the word was common, arranging workstations so workers did not waste motion. He understood that a worker who could complete one more rivet per shift across an entire yard working around the clock meant additional ships completed per month. He pushed his managers relentlessly. He pushed his workers relentlessly. In the autumn of 1942, one of Kaiser's Richmond yards achieved something that seemed almost miraculous to the watching world. They laid down a Liberty ship, began welding and riveting, and launched it in 4 days. 4 days! It was a publicity stunt. The ship would require final fitting out, before it could actually carry cargo, but it made the point with absolute clarity. American industry had fundamentally transformed the problem of warship production. The Liberty ships began flowing off the slipways in increasing numbers as 1942 progressed. In January of that year, perhaps a dozen were launched. By March, the number had climbed to several dozen. By summer, American yards were launching more than 100 Liberty ships per month. By the end of 1942, over 200 had been completed, and the rate was still accelerating. At the peak of production in 1943, American shipyards would launch roughly 2 Liberty ships every single day. The total production run would eventually reach 2,710 ships, making the Liberty the most widely produced merchant vessel in history. No warship achieved such numbers. No vessel of any kind, before or since, was manufactured at such a scale. The sheer magnitude of American industrial capacity, unleashed and directed toward this single objective, became visible in these plain, utilitarian vessels. They were not glamorous, they were not sophisticated, but they represented the mobilization of an entire continental economy toward a single urgent purpose. The significance of the Liberty ship revolution, though, extended far beyond simple numbers. These vessels changed the fundamental equation of the Atlantic War. For the first time, American shipyards began producing tonnage faster than German U-boats could sink it. In 1941, losses had outpaced replacements. In early 1942, the gap had widened catastrophically. But as Liberty ship production accelerated through the summer and autumn of 1942, the curve gradually began to flatten. By year's end, Allied shipyards were producing roughly 1.2 million tons of merchant shipping annually, a figure that would climb higher still in 1943. Donitz and his U-boat commanders could kill ships, could send them to the bottom, in spectacular conflagrations and slow sinkings. But they could no longer sink them faster than the Allies could replace them. The strategic advantage, invisible and unacknowledged at the moment, but real nonetheless, was beginning to shift. The tonnage crisis that had threatened Britain with starvation in the spring and summer of 1942 would not be solved by tactics or technology or intelligence. It would be solved by sheer American productivity. Yet for all the romance that later generations would attach to the Liberty ship as a symbol of American industrial prowess, the vessels themselves remained profoundly utilitarian and, by many accounts, deeply unpleasant places to work and to sail. The Liberty design incorporated welding rather than riveting as much as possible, a choice driven by speed, but one that produced welds that were sometimes of questionable quality and that made the ships prone to cracking in cold Atlantic water. The engines were notoriously underpowered, giving the Liberty a maximum speed of 10 knots when merchant crews needed 13 or 14. They rolled heavily in rough seas and handled poorly in heavy weather. Merchant sailors and naval officers alike complained bitterly about the Liberty's characteristics. One ship actually broke in half at sea, its welded hull fracturing under stress. Yet these complaints, though real and legitimate, missed the larger point entirely. The Liberty ship was not designed to be a masterpiece of naval architecture. It was designed to be built quickly enough, in sufficient numbers, to keep the Allies supplied with the tonnage they needed to sustain the war effort. That it achieved with remarkable success. The human cost of the Liberty ship revolution, though, was less celebrated. Workers in the shipyards faced constant danger from falling objects, from burns, from machinery, from the sheer chaotic energy of round-the-clock industrial production. Women working as riveters and welders often found themselves in the most hazardous positions, handling extremely heavy tools and working in conditions that could be brutally hot near welding operations or brutally cold near the outer hull. Black workers frequently faced not only segregation, but also the most dangerous jobs. There were injuries and deaths, some dramatic enough to make the newspapers, but many more that went unrecorded. The workers themselves, many of them drawn from rural poverty or urban unemployment, showed remarkable dedication despite the physical demands. They understood, or were told, that they were building ships to save Britain, to fight Hitler, to win the war. For many, the work itself was almost a patriotic act, even as the reality of daily labor was grinding and often dangerous. The Liberty Ship program also represented something broader about the American war effort that distinguished it from the more austere British experience. The United States had the wealth, the resources, and the industrial capacity to wage a war of material abundance. Britain was waging a war of rationing and sacrifice and careful conservation. America, while not unaffected by wartime shortages, was waging a war of overwhelming industrial production. The Liberty ships embodied this difference. They were simple, yes, and standardized. But the United States could afford to build 2,000 of them. Britain could not. The ability to replace every ship lost to U-boats, and then some, was fundamentally an American capability. It was a capability born from decades of industrial development and the specific genius of men like Henry Kaiser, who understood how to apply mass production techniques at an unprecedented scale. By late 1942, even as the merchant tonnage crisis continued to dominate strategic discussions in both London and Washington, the underlying arithmetic had begun to change. The Allies, for the first time, were winning the race between sinkings and construction. That victory would not be proclaimed from any admiralty or naval headquarters. It would not be celebrated immediately, but it was real, and it would prove decisive. As 1942 drew to a close, the Liberty Ship Revolution stood as perhaps the most undersung contribution to Allied victory in the Atlantic. The dramatic battles, the heroic exploits of convoy escorts and anti-submarine aircraft, the codebreakers at Bletchley Park, all of these captured attention and imagination. But the real victory, the one that made all other victories possible, was being built in the shipyards of America by workers who would never be celebrated, in vessels that were never beautiful, through a revolution in industrial production that seemed prosaic compared to the drama of combat at sea. The U-boat arm would continue to sink ships through 1943 and beyond. Dönitz would push for more boats and more aggressive tactics. The battle would continue in all its fury. But the outcome was already beginning to be determined, not by strategy or tactics, not by courage or sacrifice, but by the cold mathematics of industrial production. Henry Kaiser, with his assembly lines and his prefabrication techniques and his vast workforce, had found the answer that convoy systems and depth charges could not provide. He had found a way to build tonnage faster than it could be sunk. And in that discovery lay the seeds of eventual Allied victory in the Atlantic. The men hunting the hunters knew they had to change everything, and they knew they had to do it fast. By the summer of 1942, while U-boat wolfpacks were reaching the height of their devastating power in the Atlantic, the Allied naval and air commands faced a crisis that was not merely tactical, but existential. Ships were dying faster than they could be built. Sailors were drowning in numbers that dwarfed the losses of entire land campaigns. And the convoy system, the fragile lifeline that kept Britain in the war, was failing under the weight of coordinated German attacks. Yet inside the concrete bunkers of Western Approaches Command in Liverpool, and in the laboratories and test facilities scattered across Britain, a quieter kind of war was already beginning. Scientists, engineers, naval officers, and air crew were designing, testing, and refining weapons and systems that would gradually, then dramatically, reverse the momentum. This was not a story of a single breakthrough or a eureka moment of pure genius. Instead, it was the methodical, unglamorous work of learning to fight an enemy that had achieved near mastery of underwater warfare and learning it fast enough to matter before the Atlantic itself became unteachable water. The foundation of the anti-submarine effort rested on detection. A submarine that could not be found, could not be killed, and for most of 1942, the U-boat remained a ghost in the darkness, visible to escorts and aircraft only when it chose to be, or when it made a fatal mistake. ASDIC, known to the Americans as sonar, was not new technology in 1942. The British had developed primitive versions years earlier, but it was crude, and its limitations were not always understood by the men who relied on it. ASDIC worked by sending out a pulse of sound waves and listening for the echo bouncing back from a submerged object, painting a rough picture of depth, distance, and direction. In theory, it was revolutionary. In practice, it was temperamental, unreliable, and subject to the vagaries of water temperature, salinity, and the peculiar acoustic properties of different stretches of the Atlantic. A thermal layer, a band of warmer water sitting above colder water, could bend sound waves and create false echoes or mask a submarine altogether. Escorts trained on ASDIC had to unlearn the assumption that the equipment always told them the truth. The operators, skilled men who spent hours hunched over flickering screens, had to develop an almost intuitive feel for what they were seeing, learning to distinguish between a submarine, a whale, a wreck, or the equipment lying to them outright. By the middle of 1942, the most successful escort commanders understood that ASDIC was a tool with severe limitations, not a magic detection system. Improvements came through hard experience and incremental engineering. The manufacturers and the Navy slowly refined ASDIC sensitivity and resolution, reducing false readings and extending the effective detection range from around 1,000 yards to nearly twice that distance by year's end. Operators underwent more rigorous training, and the best of them became extraordinarily skilled at interpreting the blurry screens in front of them. But the real transformation in detection capability came not from ASDIC alone, but from the addition of high-frequency direction finding, a system that became known by the unwieldy acronym HFDF, or more commonly, by the nickname Huff-Duff. High-frequency direction finding worked on an entirely different principle from ASDIC. It detected radio transmissions. When a U-boat made a radio report to Admiral Donitz's headquarters at Lorient, transmitting information about convoy positions, or requesting instructions from the Wolfpack controller, that transmission created an opportunity. The transmission lasted only seconds. The Germans had trained their captains to keep broadcasts brief to minimize the risk of detection, but those seconds were enough. A ship equipped with Huff-Duff could determine the rough bearing and distance from which that transmission had come. Multiple Huff-Duff-equipped ships, or shore stations, could triangulate and fix the position of the transmitting U-boat with surprising accuracy. The problem was that Huff-Duff sets were rare and precious throughout much of 1942. The technology was so new that not enough had been manufactured to equip every escort group. The equipment was unreliable in its earliest forms and required skilled operators to interpret the readings correctly. But the men responsible for the Atlantic campaign understood its potential, and by the latter half of the year, the most critical convoys were being assigned escorts carrying Huff-Duff capability. A single Huff-Duff-equipped corvette or minesweeper sailing with a convoy could, at the moment a Wolfpack controller attempted to coordinate an attack, provide the first concrete intelligence about where the threat actually was. This could mean the difference between stumbling through a night under attack and having a real chance to locate and engage the attacker. As more ships were fitted with Huff Duff and the operators gained experience, the tide began to shift in a way that the statistics of losses and tonnage would only reflect later, but that the men involved could feel happening in real time. The weapons themselves needed to change too. The traditional depth charge, the barrel-shaped explosive that an escort would roll off the stern or launch from the side of the ship, was effective only if it actually destroyed a submarine or damaged it so severely it could not escape. Most depth charges were set to explode at specific depths, and if a U-boat managed to dive deeper than the depth settings, they would simply pass overhead and explode harmlessly in the ocean. The effective kill zone of a depth charge was surprisingly small, perhaps only 100 yards or so in any direction from the explosion. In a night surface attack in rough seas, with visibility measured in yards and the U-boat moving at speeds up to 17 knots on the surface, an escort had to be extraordinarily lucky to position itself perfectly for a depth charge run. Something better was needed, something that could attack ahead of a moving ship without requiring the escort to maneuver directly over the U-boat's position. The solution was the Hedgehog, a weapon system that lobbed a pattern of small explosive charges ahead of the escort ship in the direction the U-boat was thought to be moving. Rather than exploding on a set timer or at a particular depth, Hedgehog projectiles were contact-fused, meaning they only detonated if they actually struck a submarine. This created an entirely different tactical scenario. An escort no longer had to guess at the exact depth or position of a diving U-boat. If the Hedgehog pattern was fired accurately, one of the projectiles might find its target. The first Hedgehogs began reaching the Atlantic in small numbers in the second half of 1942, arriving first on American ships and more slowly on British vessels. The effect was not immediately transformative, but it changed the psychology of the anti-submarine hunt. Escorts suddenly had a weapon that rewarded accurate ASDIC work and aggressive pursuit with a genuinely better chance of a kill. The best hunters, men like Captain Donald McIntyre of the British Navy, whose name would become synonymous with successful escort command, began to develop tactics that combined Hedgehog attacks with traditional depth charging to maximum effect. Training became crucial. An escort that could not coordinate ASDIC operators with Hedgehog firing crews with depth charge teams had no real advantage. The integration of these systems required not just individual competence, but unit cohesion, clear communication, and repeated practice until the drills became automatic. This recognition of the need for integration and training led to one of the most significant organizational changes in the Atlantic campaign. Admiral Sir Percy Noble, who commanded the Western approaches until the middle of 1942, understood that convoy escorts could not function effectively as independent operators. A scattered group of corvettes and minesweepers, each captain doing his best individually, would be overwhelmed by coordinated wolf-pack attacks. What was needed was true coordination at the tactical level, with a senior escort officer in absolute command of all the ships in a group, with authority to direct movements and attacks in real time. Noble championed the idea of dedicated support groups, additional escort vessels that would not be permanently assigned to a specific convoy, but would be held back and dispatched at high speed toward convoys under attack. These support groups would arrive with crews that had trained together repeatedly, that understood each other's capabilities intimately, and that could surge forward to reinforce and turn around a convoy battle that was going badly. When Admiral Sir Max Horton took over from Noble in the middle of the year, he inherited an organization in ferment, and he pushed these innovations forward with remarkable energy. Horton was a former submarine captain himself, a man who understood intimately how a U-boat captain thought and what that captain feared. He believed passionately in aggressive pursuit and in the importance of unit cohesion. Under his command, support groups became increasingly formalized, with dedicated commanding officers and regular training schedules. The groups would sail from their home ports, exercise together, drill their attack procedures until they were second nature, and then remain at short notice to respond to distress calls from convoys in the Atlantic. When the order came to move, they would sail at maximum speed to intercept the threat. The impact of this innovation would take time to fully manifest, but by the end of 1942, the concept of support groups was becoming embedded in the tactical doctrine of the Royal Navy and, through coordination with American forces, in the wider Western Approaches strategy. The expansion of very long-range aircraft, commonly known as VLR aircraft, offered another crucial dimension to the anti-submarine campaign. The consolidated PBY Catalina and the newer Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, when modified to carry depth charges and equipped for long-range ocean patrol, could cover vast stretches of the Atlantic that had been wolfpack hunting grounds. A single patrol aircraft, if it appeared over a convoy under attack, could force a U-boat to dive immediately, breaking off an attack and allowing the convoy to scatter or take evasive action. The problem throughout 1942 was that there were never enough VLR aircraft, and they were desperately needed in multiple theaters simultaneously. The disagreements between air and naval commands about aircraft allocation formed a persistent source of friction within the Allied war effort. Naval commanders pleaded for more dedicated maritime patrol aircraft. Air commanders argued that fighters and bombers for the strategic bombing campaign were more important to overall Allied strategy. The compromise that emerged was unsatisfying to everyone, but slowly expanded the VLR aircraft available for Atlantic convoy protection. Training the men to use these new weapons and systems effectively became an organizational challenge unto itself. The Western Approaches Command established training bases where escort crews could be taught not just to operate individual pieces of equipment, but to work together as coordinated teams. Gunnery officers learned the tactics of anti-submarine combat. Radio operators were taught to recognize Huff-Duff signals and interpret them in real time. Depth charge crews practiced their drill until they could load, set fuses, and launch in rapid sequence without conscious thought. Hedgehog operators learned to work with ASDIC officers in a kind of intimate tactical dialogue, with the ASDIC operator calling out bearing and range, while the Hedgehog crew prepared to fire. Officers studied the tactics that had worked and those that had failed, learning from the hard experience of men who had fought wolf packs and survived to testify. The quality of this training varied, and the results depended enormously on the quality of the escort commander and his willingness to push his crews toward excellence. The integration of these elements, improved ASDIC, high-frequency direction finding, the Hedgehog weapon, support groups, VLR aircraft, and intensified training, created a transformation that was not visible in the overall statistics of 1942, but was beginning to become visible in the tactics of individual convoy battles. A U-boat that had operated with near impunity early in the year was discovering by autumn that the odds were slowly shifting. A sudden appearance on the surface might now be detected by Huff-Duff. The attempt to dive might lead not just to depth charges, but to accurate Hedgehog fire. An escort group might now be followed by a support group that could arrive within hours if radio calls went out. The margin for error, which had been nearly infinite for a skilled U-boat captain in February, was narrowing steadily by December. The men in the escort vessels and in the patrol aircraft could feel the shift. They were beginning to understand that the hunt itself had changed, that they were no longer simply victims of a superior enemy, but increasingly skilled participants in a tactical contest. The hunters were learning to hunt the hunters, and though the Atlantic campaign was far from resolved, the potential for eventual success was beginning to crystallize from uncertainty into something approaching actual possibility. The full weight of the North Atlantic struggle in 1942 cannot be understood by counting merchant ships alone. Behind every statistic of tonnage lost lay a second, more insidious campaign, one that struck at the fuel that made the entire Allied war machine function. Admiral Karl Dönitz understood something that many Allied planners were slower to grasp. Sinking a general cargo vessel was significant, but sinking a tanker carrying petroleum products was potentially war-winning. A merchant ship carrying timber or wheat represented lost supplies. A tanker in flames represented the slow strangulation of the British war effort and the paralysis of Allied naval operations across the globe. By 1942, oil had become more precious than gold, more vital than steel, and Dönitz made the destruction of tanker traffic one of his strategic obsessions. The mathematics of this campaign were brutal and stark. A single fully laden tanker, bound for Britain, carried as much fuel value as dozens of conventional cargo vessels. The bunker oil that powered Royal Navy destroyers and cruisers, the high-octane aviation fuel that filled the tanks of RAF Spitfires and Lancasters, the diesel that moved trucks and tanks across North Africa. All of it began in oil fields in the Middle East, Venezuela, or the American Gulf states, and all of it had to cross the Atlantic in steel ships. Britain in 1942 was consuming petroleum products at a rate that had become absolutely unsustainable, without uninterrupted American supply. The island nation had only enough strategic oil reserves to sustain its war effort for a matter of months. Once those reserves were depleted, the Royal Air Force would be grounded, the Royal Navy would be anchored in harbour, and the entire edifice of British military resistance would begin to crumble. Dönitz knew this calculus. His submariners knew it less consciously, but they understood the reality through their orders: find the tankers and sink them with absolute priority. The campaign against tanker traffic operated according to a different logic than the general merchant convoy war. Standard cargo convoys were dispersed across wide areas, and U-boats would attack when opportunity presented itself, sinking whatever came into their sights. Tanker convoys, by contrast, were specifically hunted. Once a U-boat sighted a tanker formation, Dönitz's operations staff would actively direct wolf packs toward the target. Tanker convoys were often more heavily laden, sitting lower in the water, and therefore slower and less maneuverable than other vessels. They were also among the most lightly escorted convoys, partly because tanker traffic followed different routes at different times, and partly because the overall shortage of escort vessels meant that not every convoy could be guarded with equal strength. The result was that a U-boat captain sighting a tanker convoy knew he had stumbled upon something precious, not just for himself and his crew's record, but for the broader German naval strategy. A successful attack on a tanker convoy meant real damage to the British war effort, measurable in weeks or months of reduced military operations. The physical reality of a tanker burning in the Atlantic Ocean created a particular kind of horror that distinguished these attacks from other sinkings. A cargo ship, when hit by a torpedo, might burn or break apart, but the cargo, wood, grain, machinery, sank without the addition of fury. A tanker, by contrast, became an inferno. When a torpedo penetrated a tanker's hull, the crude oil, or refined petroleum, stored within would erupt into flame, consuming the ship in minutes, and spreading burning oil across the surface of the ocean in a radius that could extend for hundreds of meters. Men in the water, swimming away from the wreckage, found themselves swimming through seas of burning fuel. The choice became unspeakable: remain near the burning ship and face the heat and smoke, or dive away from it and risk being pulled under by the sinking hull or struck by debris. Many tanker crew members, when they abandoned ship, found themselves covered in oil that ignited when they entered the water, or that made it impossible to move freely through the sea. The speed and intensity of tanker fires meant that rescue, always difficult in the North Atlantic, became almost impossible for ships attacked by U-boats far from escort vessels. The men who sailed in tankers endured a particular psychological weight that set them apart, even among merchant mariners, whose lives were already suspended between commerce and combat. A tanker crew member understood, in a way perhaps more visceral than a general cargo sailor, that his ship was a target of absolute priority. He knew that carrying aviation fuel was not a routine commercial duty, but an explicit combat role. He was, in effect, a combatant in the Atlantic War, even if he wore the uniform of a merchant sailor rather than a naval officer. The crew quarters on a tanker, moreover, were positioned directly above the cargo tanks in many vessel designs, a terrible vulnerability that meant an explosion from below could kill men in their bunks before they had any chance to react. The smell of petroleum product in the enclosed spaces of the ship, the awareness that every cubic meter of the vessel's holds contained a potential inferno, the knowledge that rescue from a burning tanker was statistically unlikely, all of this accumulated into a psychological burden that showed in the faces of men who had survived one tanker sinking and knew they would likely be assigned to another. The consequences of tanker losses aggregated across 1942 with a relentless logic. In the early months of the year, when Dönitz's wolf packs were still learning to coordinate their attacks effectively, tanker losses were nonetheless climbing. By the spring, when the scale and precision of wolfpack attacks reached their peak, tanker sinkings were occurring at a rate that alarmed every senior officer in the British naval and political establishment. Churchill received regular reports on tanker losses, and the fear expressed in his minutes to the First Lord of the Admiralty grew more urgent with each passing month. The problem was not merely that tankers were being sunk, but that they were being sunk faster than replacements could be built or chartered. The Anglo-American shipbuilding program was producing Liberty ships and other general cargo vessels at an accelerating rate through 1942, but tanker production lagged. Tanker construction was more complex, required more specialized equipment and skill, and could not be as readily standardized as the modular general cargo ship. The result was that even as total tonnage losses remained catastrophic, tanker losses represented a disproportionate strategic disaster. The fuel situation in Britain reached genuine crisis points through the middle months of 1942, as tanker losses accumulated. In the summer, the Royal Air Force was forced to reduce flight operations, not because of pilot shortages or aircraft losses, but because aviation fuel was being rationed to barely adequate levels for current operations. Squadrons' scheduled bombing raids were grounded not by enemy fighters, but by the arithmetic of empty fuel tanks. Royal Navy operations in the Mediterranean, which depended on fuel oil shipped through the Suez Canal and across the Atlantic, were constrained by uncertain supply. Warships that should have been at sea were forced into harbor because their fuel bunkers could not be filled. The industrial production of aircraft engines, tanks, and weaponry began to slow, not for want of materials, but because the power plants driving the factories were running on reduced fuel allocations. This second crisis, invisible to conventional military history, rarely mentioned in popular accounts of 1942, was no less real and no less dangerous than the loss of merchant ships and their crews. Admiral Dönitz understood the strategic significance of the tanker war. with clarity that his counterparts in Tokyo or Berlin often lacked. The Japanese Navy fought its island campaigns without particular attention to fuel supply until it was too late. The German army in Russia expended vast resources chasing operational victory, while fuel logistics slowly strangled the entire campaign. But Dönitz grasped, through a combination of intelligence reports and simple strategic reasoning, that oil was the limiting factor in the British war effort. If enough tankers could be destroyed, Britain could be brought to the negotiating table, not through military defeat in combat, but through the slow attrition of its ability to prosecute war. The fuel would not arrive, the factories would slow, the ships would remain in port, the aircraft would remain grounded. Britain would not have to be conquered, it would simply have to be strangled. This conviction shaped Dönitz's orders to his U-boat commanders throughout 1942. When a wolf pack was released to hunt, tanker convoys received priority. When a U-boat captain returned from patrol, his sinking of a tanker was celebrated with particular intensity. The bonuses, the press coverage, the recognition from Dönitz himself, all of it was calibrated to emphasize that the destruction of tanker traffic was not merely important, but absolutely essential. The geographic scope of the tanker war expanded as 1942 progressed, following the same pattern as the general merchant campaign. In the early months, U-boats striking American coastal waters focused on tanker traffic, precisely because tankers were concentrated in the shipping lanes near the major petroleum ports of the Gulf of Mexico and the Texas coast. The sinkings in the waters off Louisiana and Florida, visible from shore and horrifying to American civilians, included a proportionally high number of tankers. As American coastal defenses improved and convoy systems were finally implemented near the continent, the U-boat hunting grounds shifted eastward into the mid-Atlantic and across toward the British Isles. The tanker war continued to track the same migration, with Dönitz's wolf packs pursuing tanker convoys with the same systematic intensity they applied to general merchant traffic. In the waters off the Irish coast and in the approaches to the English Channel, the autumn and winter of 1942 saw tanker losses that came dangerously close to exceeding the total import capacity of the United Kingdom. The challenge faced by the Allies in protecting tanker traffic was compounded by the specialized nature of tanker handling and the political sensitivities surrounding petroleum supply. A general cargo ship could be protected by any competent naval escort, but a tanker, if damaged but not sunk, required specialized salvage and repair expertise. The refinery infrastructure needed to process crude oil into the various grades of petroleum products consumed by the war effort was itself limited. Britain had relatively few large refineries, and many were vulnerable to air attack. This meant that the loss of a tanker in transit represented not merely lost supply, but lost processing capacity and lost time, since alternative sources of fuel had to be activated and moved through different supply chains. American petroleum products, destined for Britain, could sometimes be rerouted through the Mediterranean or around the Cape of Good Hope, but these alternatives took weeks or months longer and consumed tanker space that might have been used to move other critical supplies. The logistical tangle surrounding tanker protection and petroleum distribution was never adequately resolved during 1942, remaining a background crisis that constrained every major British military operation. The human cost of the tanker campaign, while less visible than the tonnage statistics, was equally severe. Tanker crew members suffered not only higher casualty rates when their ships were sunk, but also higher rates of severe injury and psychological trauma. Men burned in oil fires, men frozen in Arctic waters after being coated in fuel that prevented normal heat regulation, men suffering flash burns from explosions in cargo holds. These casualties were often beyond the capacity of escort ship medical facilities or rescue operations to treat effectively. The long-term consequences for survivors sometimes included severe scarring, infection, or permanent physical impairment. The psychological consequences of surviving a burning tanker sinking affected men for years after the war, with nightmares and trauma that was rarely discussed in the immediate post-war period. The willingness of merchant mariners to continue serving on tankers, even after experiencing the loss of a tanker they had sailed with, represented a form of courage that military personnel, for all their training and discipline, rarely approached. By the autumn of 1942, the tanker war had established itself as a central strategic factor in the Atlantic battle, one that received less public attention than the broader convoy battles and tonnage statistics, but one that worried senior Allied planners more deeply. Churchill's correspondence with Roosevelt about the Atlantic situation in 1942 mentions tanker losses repeatedly, as does the correspondence between the British Admiralty and American Naval Command. The recognition that tanker supply was the true strategic bottleneck in British resistance shaped the later resource allocation decisions of 1943 and beyond. In the immediate moment of 1942, however, the tanker campaign represented a quiet, unacknowledged second front within the Atlantic battle, one where Dönitz pursued a strategy of asphyxiation rather than annihilation. Burn the tankers, his logic ran, and Britain's capacity for war would diminish not in a single decisive blow, but in a slow, inexorable fade. This understanding, more than any other single insight, explained why 1942 became the true crisis year of the Atlantic War, and why the defeat of the U-boat threat in 1943 required not merely more ships and better tactics, but a fundamental acknowledgement that oil logistics, not general tonnage, had been the true battlefield all along. As spring 1942 shifted towards summer along the American coast, Admiral Dönitz watched with mounting frustration as his hunters faced an increasingly difficult prospect in the waters off New York and Florida. The very success of Operation Paukenschlag had forced a reckoning. American naval forces, finally shaken from their initial paralysis, began deploying more convoy escorts, more coastal patrol vessels, and more aggressive anti-submarine tactics. Airfields along the Atlantic seaboard activated their own patrols. The easy hunting that had defined the first months of 1942, the happy time, as German submariners called it, was closing. Dönitz faced a strategic choice that would have immediate consequences, not just for the Atlantic, but for Allied operations across the entire Western Hemisphere. Rather than concentrate his forces against an increasingly well-defended American coast, he made the decision that would define the second phase of the U-boat war in 1942. He would pivot south and west, extending the reach of his wolf packs toward the Caribbean Sea, the Gulf of Mexico, and the distant coasts of South America. The game was not over. It was simply moving to a new theater, to waters that seemed impossibly distant from the primary battle in the North Atlantic, yet which held extraordinary strategic value for the Allies. The Caribbean had never been prepared for war on the scale that was about to arrive. This was a region of island chains and shallow harbors, of oil refineries and bauxite mines, of merchant traffic that had moved for centuries in conditions of relative security. The major refineries, on Aruba, on Curaçao, and on Trinidad, represented the processing centers for much of the oil being produced in Venezuela and the Dutch East Indies. These facilities were not only critical to the British and American war effort, but they were also catastrophically vulnerable. They stood on islands that possessed no air defense to speak of, no meaningful naval presence, and in the case of Aruba and Curaçao, They belonged to the Dutch government in exile, their defense still a matter of uncertain responsibility, as 1942 opened. The bauxite mines of the Guyana coast produced aluminum ore, essential for aircraft production. The merchant ships that carried these cargoes were not military vessels. They were slow, lightly armed or unarmed merchant ships, often operating without convoy, sailing routes that had been safe for generations, but which were now exposed to a predator that had learned to operate thousands of kilometers from its base. Dönitz understood with perfect clarity that the Caribbean represented not merely a new hunting ground, but a strategic weak point in the entire Allied supply chain. The first U-boats began arriving in the Caribbean during the spring and early summer of 1942, moving south from the coastal waters of North America, following routes that carried them around the Windward Passage and into the islands themselves. These were not the most modern submarines in Dönitz's fleet. Some were older Type Fickich boats. Some were the larger Type 9s, designed for exactly this kind of extended-range operation. The voyage itself was long and dangerous, carrying risks from Allied naval vessels and aircraft. But once a U-boat arrived in the Caribbean, it entered an environment where it could operate with near impunity. Merchant captains sailing these waters had received little training in evasion. There were no organized convoy systems, no coordinated escort groups, no anti-submarine forces waiting to respond. A U-boat could take its time approaching a target, could attack on the surface at night with little fear of interruption, could sink a ship and be gone before any meaningful response could be organized. The strategic logic was almost irresistible. If a U-boat could sink one ship every few days in this region, while operating relatively safely, the cumulative toll would be enormous. Dönitz made the commitment, and throughout 1942, the number of U-boats operating in Caribbean waters grew. The first casualties were merchant ships, whose names disappeared into the records almost without notice. Small tankers, cargo vessels, the occasional passenger cargo ship carrying civilians and military personnel. A ship burning in the Caribbean lost just as much oil, just as much bauxite, just as many supplies as a ship sunk in the North Atlantic, but it sank far from the organized networks of escort and response that were, however imperfectly, developing in the main theater. The sinkings began in late spring and accelerated through the summer months. Merchant crews would later describe the eerie quality of being attacked in tropical waters at night, with a U-boat surfaced within sight, its gun crews hammering shells into a defenseless ship. The heat of the Caribbean night, the phosphorescence of the water, the smell of burning oil and diesel fuel mixing with salt spray, and the cries of wounded men, these formed a particular horror that was somehow more shocking than the same experience in the cold darkness of the North Atlantic. Ships that sank in northern waters might have rescue within hours. Ships that sank in the Caribbean often left their survivors in lifeboats drifting under a merciless sun, with no nearby shipping lanes, no guarantee of rescue, with days or weeks of exposure ahead of them. The casualty rate among merchant crews in the Caribbean during 1942 exceeded even the terrible rate in the Atlantic. An ordinary merchant sailor in these waters faced odds that had become quietly catastrophic. The American response was slow and frustrated. The United States Navy lacked the resources to establish meaningful convoy protection in the Caribbean, and the chain of command responsibility was confused. The Panama Canal, which cut through the region, fell under the protection of the Caribbean Defense Command, a joint command that struggled to coordinate between American, British, and Canadian forces. Air coverage came from scattered American airfields, but many of these fields were still being constructed or equipped through much of 1942. The vast distances of the Caribbean meant that a single aircraft could cover only a tiny fraction of the sea at any one time. U-boat captains learned quickly the patrol patterns of American aircraft and timed their attacks for the hours when the sea was undefended. Merchant ships continued to sail individually or in loose groups, hoping to avoid detection, but in a vast, shallow sea with limited hiding places, detection was nearly inevitable. The monthly tonnage losses in the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico during the summer of 1942 climbed steadily. By some estimates, nearly 1/4 of all merchant shipping losses in July and August of 1942 occurred in these warm waters, far from the main Atlantic battlefield. The American Naval High Command in Washington and London recognized the disaster unfolding, but struggled to find resources to respond. The main Atlantic convoy routes had to remain the priority. Britain could not survive without transatlantic supplies, which left the Caribbean increasingly to its fate. The Gulf of Mexico presented its own particular vulnerability. American oil production in Texas and Louisiana fed not only the American war machine, but was meant to supply Britain as well. Refineries along the Texas coast and near New Orleans transformed crude oil into the fuel that powered warships, aircraft, and armies. Tanker traffic from these refineries moved through the Straits of Florida and into the Caribbean, or moved around Florida and into the Atlantic approaches to New York and other northern ports. These tanker routes had never been dangerous. For generations, American oil had moved without significant protection. But in 1942, U-boats began to appear in the waters of the Gulf itself. The first attacks came in May and June. A U-boat commander would arrive in the Gulf, stay for weeks, and sink 3 or 4 or 5 tankers before being forced out by increasing American patrols. The psychological impact was enormous. War had come to waters that many Americans considered almost domestic, almost part of home. The loss of tankers from American oil fields meant either that less fuel reached distant theaters, or that American domestic consumption had to be restricted. Gasoline rationing in the United States was partly a response to genuine shipping losses, and partly a response to the public demand that something had to be done about German submarines operating in American territorial waters. The U-boats, once again, were winning a psychological battle as much as a military one. Brazil emerged as an unexpected but crucial theater in this expanded submarine war. The Brazilian coast lies far to the south and east, but Brazilian waters carried traffic in iron ore, in rubber, and in other strategic materials that moved northward toward North America or eastward toward Africa and the Suez route. Brazilian ports were vulnerable and Brazilian defenses were minimal. Through the spring and early summer of 1942, U-boats operating off the Brazilian coast sank merchant ships with little interference. The Brazilian government protested to both the Allies and the Germans, but Brazil had not yet entered the war and remained nominally neutral. The attacks continued regardless. By early summer, the accumulating attacks on Brazilian shipping began to generate political pressure within Brazil itself. The government faced domestic demands for action, either diplomatic or military. German intelligence and diplomatic efforts sought to keep Brazil neutral, or at least benign. But the campaign against Brazilian shipping was making neutrality increasingly untenable. The sinkings continued through the summer months. Ship after ship, bearing Brazilian flags, went to the bottom. Survivors washed ashore on Brazilian beaches, told stories of attacks in broad daylight, of U-boats that showed no fear of retaliation. The political pressure inside Brazil mounted week after week. This was not the calculation that Germany wanted. The whole point of the extended submarine campaign was to damage the Allied cause, not to drive neutral nations into the Allied camp. But the logic of the war, the imperative to sink tonnage and sink more tonnage, drove German policy forward, regardless of political consequences. By late summer of 1942, Brazil's political balance began to shift visibly. The Brazilian government, led by President Getúlio Vargas, faced mounting public opinion, demanding retaliation against the U-boats. More than a dozen merchant ships had been sunk. The families of dead sailors demanded justice. In August, yet another Brazilian ship was sunk off the coast. The government seized the moment. On the 22nd of August, 1942, Brazil declared war on Germany and Italy. The nation that had sat on the fence of American hemispheric politics for generations had been pushed, almost casually, into the Allied camp by the mechanics of submarine warfare. Donitz's expansion of U-boat operations into the Caribbean and the broader Atlantic approaches to South America had achieved something quite unexpected. It had eliminated Brazil's neutrality and producing any compensatory strategic gain. The addition of Brazilian forces to the Allied cause was not immediately decisive, but it represented a strategic miscalculation. The submarine campaign was generating casualties and losses, but it was simultaneously generating political enemies, where there had been none before. The calculation that had seemed so clear in Berlin, sink tonnage, damage the enemy, had produced consequences that extended far beyond the tonnage calculations. The scale of the U-boat offensive in these expanded waters reached its crescendo in the autumn months of 1942. At any given moment, there were typically 4 to 6 U-boats operating somewhere in the Caribbean or Gulf of Mexico region, and another 2 or 3 working off the Brazilian coast or in the South Atlantic approaches. The transit times were long. A U-boat might spend 2 weeks traveling to the operational area and 2 weeks returning, but once on station, a single boat could sink a substantial amount of tonnage. The cumulative effect was a steady drain on Allied merchant shipping capacity in this region. Island economies that depended on imported food and supplies found their lifelines strained. Oil refineries that were operating at high capacity suddenly faced restrictions because tanker traffic had been disrupted. The American military found itself forced to divert warships and transport vessels from other theaters to maintain supply lines to the Caribbean and to maintain American forces in the region. This was, in a sense, exactly what Dönitz wanted. He could not have wished for more dramatic evidence that the submarine weapon, used flexibly and with strategic imagination, could damage the enemy's war effort far beyond the mere statistics of tonnage sunk. The U-boats were not just killing merchant ships. They were forcing the Allies to respond, to allocate resources, to reorganize supply lines, to confront new vulnerabilities in their strategic position. Yet the campaign in the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico also exposed fundamental limitations in the U-boat strategy. Dönitz had gambled that expanding operations into distant waters would sustain and increase pressure on the Allies as defenses stiffened along the main Atlantic routes. That gamble had partially succeeded. The tonnage losses were real and significant, and the disruption to supply lines was genuine. But the expansion had also dispersed the U-boat fleet. Boats that were operating in the Caribbean were not operating in the mid-Atlantic, where the convoy battles were being decided. The wolf pack tactics that had proven so devastatingly effective against convoys in the North Atlantic could not function in the same way against scattered merchant traffic in warm waters. A U-boat hunting off the coast of Trinidad was operating almost in isolation, without the coordinated support of other boats, without the sophisticated command and control networks that made wolfpack attacks so deadly. Dönitz had traded concentration for reach, and the long-term strategic consequences of that trade were not yet fully apparent in 1942, but would become increasingly important as the Atlantic campaign evolved through the years ahead. The human experience of being a merchant sailor in the Caribbean during 1942 took on its own particular quality. The risks were as severe as in the North Atlantic, but the environment was entirely different. A man rescued after being torpedoed in the Caribbean might spend days in a lifeboat under the tropical sun, with little fresh water, watching the water darken with blood, where sharks were drawn to the wreck. The medical facilities on rescue ships, when rescue came at all, were often basic or non-existent. Some Caribbean islands were extremely remote, and a lifeboat adrift in that vastness might go undiscovered for a very long time. The merchant sailors sailing these waters, Americans, Britons, Dutch, and sailors from numerous other nations, developed a particular stoicism about their situation. The danger was constant and inescapable. Death could come at any moment, from any direction. Some ships developed collective coping mechanisms, rituals or routines, that helped crews maintain cohesion and psychological balance. Officers and crew learned to watch each other, to recognize the signs of men beginning to break under the strain, and to provide whatever small support or relief could be offered. The ports where merchant ships docked in the Caribbean became places where sailors collected information, rumors, and confirmed reports of U-boat sightings, attacks, losses. Knowledge that a certain route had seen recent attacks would ripple through the merchant community quickly. Routes would be changed, but there were only so many ways to move between the islands and the mainland, and U-boat captains quickly learned the most probable tracks. By the end of 1942, the U-boat offensive in the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico had claimed hundreds of thousands of tons of merchant shipping and had killed several thousand merchant sailors and soldiers traveling on merchant vessels. The strategic objectives had been partially met. Supplies for the Allies had been disrupted. Oil production had been strained. Bauxite shipments had been stamed. By the autumn of 1942, Admiral Dönitz faced a problem that no amount of tactical brilliance could entirely solve. His wolf packs were sinking ships faster than the Allies could build them, yet the very geography of the Atlantic imposed hard limits on his success. A Type 5 U-boat, the workhorse of the German submarine fleet, could remain on patrol in the North Atlantic for roughly 3 weeks before fuel reserves forced it to begin the long journey home. The vast distances involved meant that much of an operational boat's time was consumed simply in transit, leaving only a narrow window for actual hunting. The farther the hunting ground from Lorient or other German bases, the fewer days a boat could spend attacking convoys. Dönitz understood that victory in the Atlantic would ultimately belong to whoever could sustain pressure longest, and his boats were running out of endurance. Yet within the German naval engineering establishment, a solution was already being conceived, one that would extend the reach of the U-boat arm across the entire breadth of the Atlantic and fundamentally alter the strategic equation of 1942. The Type 14 submarine, known throughout the German fleet as the Milchcow, was not a weapon of destruction, but rather a weapon of logistics. These boats were roughly the same length as a Type 7, but were gutted of their torpedo tubes and combat equipment, their internal volume instead packed with fuel oil, fresh water, food stores, ammunition, and spare parts. The concept was deceptively simple. A supply boat would sail to a predetermined position in the Atlantic, remain there for a set period, and refuel and rearm as many operational U-boats as could rendezvous with it. A single refueling session could extend a Type 7's patrol by 2 or 3 weeks, dramatically multiplying the time it could spend in the hunting grounds. From the German perspective, this was revolutionary. Rather than building additional Type 7 submarines, Dönitz could take a small number of Type 14s and, in theory, triple the effective strength of his fleet without a proportional increase in construction resources or the time required to build and train crews. The first Milchcow entered service early in 1942, and by summer, 3 Type 14s were operational, with more under construction at yards in Germany and occupied France. The operational choreography of a U-boat rendezvous with a milch cow was a delicate affair, requiring precise coordination and considerable risk for all parties involved. The supply boat would proceed to a designated grid position, often in the remote reaches of the mid-Atlantic, where air patrols were either non-existent or sporadic. An operational U-boat, approaching the end of its endurance, would receive a coded radio message from Dönitz's headquarters at Lorient, directing it to the rendezvous point with specific timing. The two boats would meet in conditions that made both extremely vulnerable. Surfaced, close together, with fuel hoses and ammunition lines connecting them, unable to dive or maneuver rapidly if danger approached. The refueling process itself could take hours, during which neither boat could respond effectively to air attack or the sudden appearance of an Allied warship. This necessitated the assignment of a protective escort, usually a pair of Type 7 boats positioned nearby, to provide warning and defense. The human element was crucial. Skilled radio men, navigators who could guide their boats to a precise ocean location, hundreds of kilometers from land, and commanders calm enough to manage the process without panic when weather turned rough or false alarms of approaching aircraft rippled through the rendezvous group. What made the milch cow strategy so strategically potent was the mathematical multiplication it enabled. A single Type 14 could refuel up to 4 or 5 boats during a patrol cycle, and if it could complete 2 refueling operations before returning to base, its impact on fleet effectiveness was enormous. An operational U-boat that previously had to abandon its patrol and return to port with fuel reserves remaining could now continue hunting for another 3 weeks after its first refueling, return to the supply boat for a second top-off, and remain on station for even longer. Some boats, when operating in concert with milch cows, remained on extended patrols, lasting 4 months or more, an impossibility under previous logistical constraints. Dönitz grasped the implication immediately. Without building a single additional operational U-boat, he had extended the effective range of his fleet to cover not just the North Atlantic approaches to Britain, but the Caribbean, the approaches to South America, and the western coast of Africa. The Type 14 represented not merely a supply vessel, but a strategic multiplier, and it became central to his planning for maintaining and escalating pressure through 1942 and beyond. The response from the Allied intelligence and anti-submarine community, once the existence of the milch cows became known, was one of urgent concern. A supply submarine represented a concentration point in the vast ocean, a place where multiple U-boats would converge and remain vulnerable for extended periods. If the Allies could locate a rendezvous, they could potentially destroy not only the supply boat itself, but sink several operational boats gathered for refueling. The hunt for milch cows became a specialized task, requiring close coordination between naval intelligence, radio direction finding stations, and the anti-submarine task forces being assembled in 1942. High-frequency direction, finding equipment on escort vessels, could sometimes detect the radio transmissions associated with rendezvous operations, providing rough bearings to the supply boat's positions. Bletchley Park's codebreakers, when they could read the German naval enigma, often had access to the coordinates and timing of refueling operations, allowing the Allies to position hunting forces accordingly. Yet the milch cow's inherent advantage was their rarity and the vastness of the ocean. Even with intelligence indicating a rendezvous somewhere, in a particular grid square spanning hundreds of square kilometers, actually locating the boats in time required luck, good reconnaissance, and rapid deployment of available forces. Through 1942, the Allies achieved sporadic success against the milch cow fleet. Aircraft patrols, particularly from the Azores, when that strategic foothold finally became available, could occasionally force supply submarines to dive and break off their refueling missions, but actually sinking them proved far more difficult. Yet the very threat of Allied forces searching for refueling rendezvous points imposed constraints on Dönitz's operations. Rendezvous positions had to be constantly moved, refueling schedules adjusted, and protective measures increased. A milch cow that had to remain in radio silence or move constantly to avoid detection was a milch cow that could not effectively supply the operational fleet. The cat-and-mouse game between the milch cow system and Allied hunting forces represented a hidden second front within the larger Atlantic battle, rarely dramatized in strategic histories, but genuinely crucial to the balance of forces as 1942 unfolded. The human experience aboard a Type 14 was markedly different from that on an operational U-boat, in ways both better and worse. A supply boat had no combat role, which meant its crew faced no likelihood of direct combat engagement, but it also meant they were essentially defenseless if discovered by Allied forces. They carried no torpedoes to strike back, no ability to fight their way out of danger. The crew was smaller than on an operational Type 7, with perhaps 40 men instead of 50, and they spent their patrols in a state of constant, underlying tension. Part of the crew's responsibility was monitoring radio frequencies for signals indicating that an operational U-boat was approaching, then maintaining radio contact while coordinating the rendezvous. Other crew members spent their patrols maintaining equipment, checking fuel lines and hose connections, and ensuring that supplies remained organized and accessible for rapid transfer. A milch cow in the Atlantic was essentially a floating supply depot, and its entire purpose was to enable others to continue fighting. Many men serving aboard these boats viewed their role with a quiet pride. They were part of Dönitz's system, and without them, the hunting packs could not function. The broader strategic picture in 1942, seen through the lens of the milch cow system, reveals the degree to which Dönitz was committed to sustained, even escalating pressure on the Atlantic convoy routes. By autumn, with 3 or 4 milch cows operational and additional boats under construction, the German submarine admiral could confidently project that his wolf packs would maintain or increase their hunting tempo, not just through the remainder of 1942, but well into 1943. The supply system meant he did not face a sudden drop-off in available operational boats as his original patrol complements matured and required refits. It meant that the vast distances to hunting grounds in the Caribbean, the Gulf of Mexico, and off Brazil were no longer absolute constraints. It meant that, from a purely logistical standpoint, Dönitz could theoretically sustain simultaneous wolf pack operations in multiple ocean regions, each with its own dedicated milch cow providing extended supplies. This was the utopian vision that animated German naval planning in the late months of 1942. A U-boat fleet multiplied in effective strength, freed from the tyranny of distance, capable of bleeding the Atlantic convoy system white for months or even years to come. Yet even as the milch cow system extended German reach in the Atlantic, it also introduced a new point of vulnerability into Dönitz's carefully constructed machine. Every refueling rendezvous required radio communications, and every radio signal carried the risk of direction-finding detection. Every milch cow that sailed from Lorient left a departure that could be observed or deduced by Allied intelligence. Every refueling operation, even when successful, consumed time and left the boats involved in a state of reduced readiness. The very coordination that made the system effective also made it traceable. Bletchley Park's mathematicians and cryptanalysts understood that if they could read the German naval enigma reliably, they would have regular access to the grid coordinates where milch cows were operating. Allied task forces, once alerted, could move to intercept. The system was brilliant and innovative, but it was not impervious. And as 1942 advanced into autumn, the question was whether the Allies could locate and destroy the milch cows faster than Germany could build and deploy them. The answer to that question would not fully emerge until 1943, but the foundation for that struggle was laid entirely within 1942. The appearance of the Type 14 in German service represented a fundamental escalation in the sophistication of the U-boat campaign. No longer was the Atlantic battle simply one of fast attack boats versus slow convoys and their escorts. It had become a complex logistical competition in which supply and range were as important as torpedoes and gunnery. Dönitz had solved, at least temporarily, the problem of his boat's limited endurance by creating a mobile supply network. The Allies, in response, had to develop new tactics for locating and destroying that network, while simultaneously defending convoys, training escorts, and expanding their own aircraft and naval resources. The milch cow system captured, in microcosm, the increasingly complicated technological and logistical dimensions of the Atlantic War as 1942 deepened. The strategic implications were not lost on either side. In German naval headquarters, the operational reports of successful milch cow rendezvous were celebrated as proof that Dönitz's vision for a sustained, escalating U-boat campaign was achievable. The supply boats represented not a desperate improvisation, but a sign of German innovation and confidence. For the Allies, the discovery of the Type 14 program was sobering. It suggested that the German submarine threat, rather than burning itself out through attrition, might instead deepen and multiply. If Dönitz could sustain 10 or 12 milch cows in operation simultaneously, the effective U-boat fleet could be enlarged by a factor of 3 or 4 without proportional increases in submarine construction. The arithmetic was frightening. British and American naval planners suddenly faced not just the immediate crisis of 1942's mounting losses, but the prospect of a worse crisis to come in 1943, when Dönitz's supply system would be fully developed and German yards were producing both operational boats and milch cows at accelerating rates. What neither side could fully predict in 1942 was how fragile the entire system would prove once the Allies successfully breached it. The milch cows were few in number, and they operated in a narrow window of vulnerability every time they refueled an operational boat. They were also identifiable once intelligence revealed their existence and design. The very coordination that made them effective also made them traceable through radio intercepts and traffic analysis. Over the course of 1943, the Allies would systematically hunt down and destroy the Type 14 fleet, eliminating the supply system that Dönitz had constructed. But that campaign belonged to the future. In 1942, the milk cow represented the full expression of German confidence, innovation, and the belief that industrial and logistical solutions could overcome the Allies' growing material superiority. It was the last great innovation in the campaign that gave Dönitz confidence that the Atlantic could still be won. The legacy of the Type 14 extended beyond its immediate operational impact in 1942. The very concept of a supply submarine introduced Allied planners to the idea that fleet warfare could be conducted across vast distances with mobile logistics, a lesson that would shape naval thinking for generations. More immediately, it forced the Allies to integrate anti-submarine warfare, intelligence analysis, and air reconnaissance into a unified hunting effort. Convoys could not be protected without understanding the supply system that sustained the predators. The milch cow campaign Though less famous than the great convoy battles of May or the merchant ship sinkings off the American coast, was equally important to the shape of the Atlantic War in 1942. It represented the moment when the U-boat challenge transformed from a pure combat problem into a logistics and intelligence problem, requiring solution through coordination and innovation as much as through tactical skill. In this sense, the Milch Cow was not merely a supply boat, but a catalyst that deepened and complicated the Atlantic battle in ways that would define 1943 and beyond. The numbers on the charts and maps tell one story. The ledgers in the operations rooms of London and Washington tell another. But there is a third story, one that lived and died in the North Atlantic throughout 1942. And it is a story written not in tonnage or coordinates, but in the voices of ordinary men clinging to fragments of wood in water colder than ice could be. When a merchant ship broke apart under the force of a torpedo strike, when steel buckled inward and oil ignited across the surface of the sea, the mathematics of war became immediate and unmistakable. A ship that had carried cargo from one continent to another vanished in minutes. The men aboard it did not vanish so quickly. Their survival, their suffering, and their eventual rescue, or their slow descent into darkness, formed the true measure of the Atlantic battle, the weight that no strategic calculation could fully capture. A merchant seaman torpedoed on the deck of a tanker in February 1942 experienced something beyond the comprehension of those who planned the war from behind desks. The explosion was not distant or theoretical. It was heat and sound that consumed thought itself. If a man was fortunate enough to be topside when the torpedo struck, he might have seconds to move. If he was below decks, he often had nothing. The men working in the engine rooms and holds of merchant vessels knew, with a knowledge that was both certain and unspoken, that a torpedo could find them at any hour of day or night, that escape might not be possible, that they might burn, or drown, or freeze, or all three in sequence. They went to sea anyway, month after month, voyage after voyage, because the alternative was dishonor or conscription. This was the quiet courage of the merchant marine, a courage that went largely unsung and was perhaps for that reason all the more profound. For those who survived the initial sinking, the real ordeal often only began. A lifeboat launched in darkness, with emergency rations meant to last 3 days, but carrying men for 2 weeks. The Atlantic, in winter, offers no mercy. A man in ordinary clothes, despite efforts to climb into a lifeboat fully, would begin to lose function within minutes, in water below 5 degrees. Once in a boat, hypothermia came more slowly, but with equal certainty. The body's core temperature dropped degree by degree. Coherence dissolved into confusion. Men hallucinated, spoke to the dead, lost the ability to care whether they lived or died. The cold was not something that happened around them, but something that happened inside them, a slow thief, stealing heat and will simultaneously. Those who survived often reported that the worst was not the cold itself, but the awareness that they were dying, that consciousness remained long enough for them to understand what was happening, that there was nothing to be done about it. The work of rescue placed convoy commodores and senior escort commanders in an impossible position that was repeated week after week throughout 1942. A ship had sunk. Lifeboats were visible on the horizon, or caught by searchlights in darkness. Men could be heard crying out, their voices carrying across water. The standing order from Naval Command was clear. A convoy must not stop. A stationary convoy was a target that Dunitz's wolf packs would exploit without hesitation. A convoy commander who ordered the escort to pause while survivors were recovered might himself become responsible for the loss of an entire convoy, for the death of thousands of men,